I am just a chronicler and welcome you to another video. Since I know many of you watch to relax and fall asleep, I thought it would be nice if you left a comment telling me where you're listening from and if it's raining there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Now, it's time to get comfortable, relax, and begin. The crackle of the campfire couldn't drown out the whispers in the dark. They were out there, watching us. I could feel their eyes boring into me, even through the walls of our RV. What had started as a peaceful family camping trip had morphed into a waking nightmare, and I feared we'd never make it out of these godforsaken woods alive. It all began innocently enough. My wife Sarah, our 2 kids, Tommy, 10, and Lisa, 8. And I had been planning this trip to the Ozarks for months. We'd saved up, bought a second-hand RV, and packed it full of supplies and dreams of adventure. The drive from our home in St. Louis had been full of excited chatter and pit stops at quirky roadside attractions. As we wound our way deeper into the mountains, the cell signal bars on our phones dwindled to nothing. I remember Sarah joking, "Looks like we're really going off the grid." If only we'd known how prophetic those words would become. We found a beautiful clearing to set up camp, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to touch the sky. The kids were over the moon, running around collecting pine cones and spotting wildlife. That first afternoon was idyllic. We hiked a nearby trail, roasted hot dogs over the fire, and fell asleep to the gentle hooting of owls. It was on the second day that things started to feel off. We decided to explore the nearest town, a tiny place called Millbrook, to stock up on some fresh supplies. As we walked down the main street, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shopkeeper, every passerby seemed to stare a beat too long, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. In the general store, an old man struck up a conversation as I was picking out some locally made jam. "You folks camping up in Whispering Pines?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded. "Yeah, beautiful spot. You know it." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, we all know it. Beautiful, sure. But be careful up there. Nature has a way of keeping its secrets." Before I could ask what he meant, he shuffled away, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the store's air conditioning. That night, as we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows, the woods seemed different, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. Tommy was the first to notice it. "Dad," he whispered, his eyes wide. "I think I saw someone in the trees." I played it cool, not wanting to scare the kids. Probably just a deer buddy. "Remember those tracks we saw earlier?" But as I scanned the tree line, I caught a flicker of movement. Just for a second, but enough to make my heart race. I ushered everyone into the RV early that night, citing tiredness from our day in town. As I lay awake, straining my ears for any unusual sound, I heard it. Whispers, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, but undeniably there. A low murmur of voices, just on the edge of comprehension. I wanted to wake Sarah, to have her confirm I wasn't losing my mind, but I didn't want to frighten her. Not yet. The next morning, I made an excuse to check around our campsite while the family ate breakfast. That's when I found the first camera. Small, well hidden in the crook of a tree, its lens pointed directly at our RV. My blood ran cold as I realized it was far too sophisticated to be for wildlife observation. I didn't tell Sarah right away. I convinced myself there must be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the Park Service was monitoring for wildfires or tracking an endangered species. But deep down, I knew we were being watched. Over the next 2 days, my paranoia grew. I found 3 more cameras, all carefully concealed. The whispers at night became more frequent, sometimes accompanied by the snap of a twig or the rustle of underbrush. The few hikers we encountered on the trails seemed to appear out of nowhere, their friendly greetings at odds with their scrutinizing gazes. It was on the 5th day that things escalated. We returned from a hike to find our campsite different. Nothing was missing or damaged, but things had been moved. The chairs around the fire pit were rearranged. The kids' toys were neatly stacked instead of scattered where they'd left them. Sarah's favorite coffee mug was sitting on the picnic table, full of fresh wildflowers. "John," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "what's going on?" I couldn't hide it anymore. I told her everything. The cameras, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. Her face paled as I spoke, and I saw the same fear in her eyes that had been gnawing at me for days. "We need to leave," she whispered, clutching Tommy and Lisa close. "Now." I nodded, already moving to pack up our essentials. But as I turned to step into the RV, I saw them, at least a dozen people, standing silently at the edge of our clearing. Men and women of all ages, some I recognized from town, others strangers. All watching us with the same cold, calculating stare. An older woman, her grey hair wild around her weathered face, stepped forward. Now, she said, her voice sickly sweet, "leaving so soon. But you've only just arrived. We have so much planned for you." Sarah clutched the kids tighter as I stepped in front of them. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" The woman's smile widened, revealing too many teeth. "Want? Oh, nothing much. Just a little participation. You see, these woods, they have a hunger. And you, my dears, you're the feast." As if on cue, the others began to move forward, encircling our campsite. I could hear Sarah fumbling with her phone behind me, desperately trying to call for help, but I knew it was useless. We were alone out here. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Lisa as Sarah scooped up Tommy. We bolted for the RV, the sound of pursuing footsteps right behind us. I've never started a vehicle faster in my life. The engine roared to life as I slammed it into drive, not even waiting for Sarah to fully close the door. We tore out of the clearing, the faces of our pursuers flashing by in a blur. The narrow, winding road was a nightmare to navigate at speed, especially in a lumbering RV. Trees whipped by, branches scraping against the sides like claws trying to hold us back. In the rearview mirror, I could see headlights gaining on us. "John, look out!" Sarah screamed. I swerved just in time to avoid a fallen tree blocking half the road. The RV tilted dangerously, nearly going up on 2 wheels before slamming back down. The kids were crying in the back, and I could hear Sarah trying to comfort them while keeping an eye out for more obstacles. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, every turn a gamble between maintaining our lead and rolling the vehicle. We burst out onto a main road, tires screeching as I fought to keep control. The headlights behind us were falling back, but I didn't dare slow down. We drove for hours, long after the pursuit seemed to have ended, the fear of what lay behind us pushing me forward. It wasn't until we crossed the state line that I finally felt safe enough to pull over at a rest stop. We were all shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting us hard. Sarah held the kids close, murmuring soothing words even as tears streaked her cheeks. "Are they gone, Daddy?" Lisa asked, her small voice quivering. I wanted to say yes, to assure them that the nightmare was over. But the truth was, I didn't know. Those people, that woman with her talk of hunger and feasts, It all seemed too organized, too practiced. How many other families had they lured into their trap? "They're not following us anymore, sweetheart," I said, choosing my words carefully. "We're safe now." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only just escaped something far larger and more sinister than we could comprehend. The Ozarks held their secrets close, and we had come dangerously close to becoming one of them. As we pulled back onto the highway, heading for the safety of home and civilization, I made a silent vow. We would tell our story, warn others. Because out there in those beautiful, treacherous woods, something was waiting, watching, hungry, and I feared we wouldn't be the last to stumble into its grasp. Story 2. The first gunshot echoed through the howling wind, jolting me from my hypothermic stupor. I huddled deeper into the corner of the cabin, my numb fingers clutching the rusty fireplace poker, my only weapon against whoever was out there in the blizzard. As a second shot rang out, closer this time, I realized with grim certainty that my desperate search for shelter had led me straight into a trap. Just 12 hours earlier, I had been full of excitement, setting out on what was supposed to be a challenging but rejuvenating solo hike through the Rockies. The weather forecast had promised clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for testing my skills and clearing my head after months of grueling work in the city. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I navigated the steadily climbing trail, my boots crunching satisfyingly on the mix of gravel and early autumn leaves. I stopped often to marvel at the breathtaking vistas, snow-capped peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that I noticed the first warning signs. The wind picked up, carrying with it a biting chill that cut through my layers. Dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, moving with alarming speed. I checked my phone, hoping to get an updated forecast, but the screen showed no signal. A knot of unease formed in my stomach. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the next trail marker, where I knew there was an emergency shelter. But the weather deteriorated faster than I could have imagined. Within an hour, I was fighting my way through a full-blown blizzard. The wind howling like a beast and snow so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. Disoriented and chilled to the bone, I stumbled off the trail. Panic began to set in as I realized I had no idea which direction I was heading. My thoughts turned to all the stories I'd read about hikers found frozen solid just yards from safety. I couldn't let that be me. That's when I saw it, a dark shape looming through the curtain of white. As I drew closer, I could make out the outline of a small cabin. It wasn't on any of the trail maps I'd studied, but at that moment, it looked like salvation. I practically fell against the door, my numb hands fumbling with the handle. It was locked. "Hello?" I shouted, pounding on the wood. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." No answer came, but as I leaned my weight against the door, I felt it give slightly. Desperation lending me strength, I rammed my shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times. With a crack of splintering wood, it burst open. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me against the howling wind. For a moment, I just stood there, panting, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The cabin was small, just one room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a narrow cot in the corner. It looked long abandoned, a thick layer of dust covering every surface. But as my initial relief faded, I began to notice details that set my nerves on edge. A pair of muddy boots by the door, much too large to be mine. A jacket hanging on a peg, its material still damp. And on the table, a steaming mug of coffee, wisps of vapor curling into the air. Someone had been here recently, and they might come back any moment. I debated making a run for it, but one look out the grimy window told me that wasn't an option. The storm had turned the world outside into a howling white void. I was trapped here, for better or worse. With shaking hands, I built a fire in the grate, grateful for the pile of dry logs stacked nearby. As warmth slowly returned to my limbs, I took stock of my situation. My pack had basic survival supplies, some energy bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight. It would have to do. I tried to convince myself that the cabin's owner would understand when they returned, that they'd be glad to have helped a fellow hiker in need. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that if they were the kind, understanding type, they wouldn't have left their cabin locked in the middle of a blizzard. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of letting up. I dozed fitfully in a chair by the fire, jerking awake at every creak of the cabin's timbers. In one of these half-waking moments, my eye caught something glinting in the firelight. Curious, I moved closer to the wall, brushing away a layer of dust. My blood ran cold. Hidden behind years of grime was a collection of photographs, dozens of them, each showing a different person. Hikers, like me, smiling at the camera, their backpacks visible. But something was off about their expressions. The smiles seemed forced, their eyes wide with barely concealed fear. With growing horror, I noticed dates scrawled beneath each photo. The most recent was just 2 weeks ago. A floorboard creaked behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. The cabin was empty, but the door was ajar, icy wind whipping snow onto the threshold. I was certain I'd closed it. Panic clawing at my throat, I lunged for my pack. I had to get out of here, storm be damned. But as I reached for the strap, my flashlight beam caught something that stopped me in my tracks. Scratched into the wooden floor, nearly hidden beneath the edge of the cot, was a message. Don't trust. Trap. Run. The sound of crunching snow came from just outside. Heavy footsteps, approaching slowly. My mind raced. The message, the photos, the fresh coffee. It all pointed to something sinister. This wasn't just some isolated cabin. It was a hunting ground. I doused the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness. Fumbling in my pack, I found the fireplace poker I'd stashed there earlier. An impromptu weapon I now clutched like a lifeline. I pressed myself into the corner furthest from the door, trying to steady my ragged breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could hear the rasp of a hand on the doorknob. A gunshot shattered the night. I bit back a scream, certain I'd been found. But the shot hadn't come from inside the cabin. It had come from somewhere in the woods. A gruff voice called out, words whipped away by the wind. Another shot, closer this time. Whoever was outside the cabin shouted something in response, their voice tight with what sounded like fear. More footsteps crunched in the snow, moving away from the cabin. The sounds of pursuit faded into the storm. For a long moment, I remained frozen in place, straining my ears for any sign of their return. But only the howl of the wind answered. Slowly, carefully, I crept to the window. Through a break in the snow, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Multiple sets of footprints led away from the cabin, along with dark spatters. There could only be blood. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I just witnessed some kind of turf war between rival predators? Or was there something even more sinister at play in these mountains? One thing was clear. I couldn't stay here. This cabin was far from the sanctuary I'd thought it to be. It was a trap, and I'd walked right into it. With shaking hands, I repacked my bag, adding what supplies I could scavenge from the cabin. As I did, I noticed something I'd overlooked before. A map, partially hidden beneath the coffee mug on the table. It showed the surrounding area in detail I'd never seen before, including markers for what looked like other cabins. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. This wasn't just one trap, but an entire network. How many unsuspecting hikers had fallen victim to whatever sick game was being played out here in the wilderness? I memorized the map as best I could before stuffing it into my pocket. If I made it out of here alive, I'd make sure the authorities knew about this place. The storm had lessened somewhat, now more of a steady snowfall than a raging blizzard. It wasn't ideal, but it was now or never. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the night. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to keep moving. I picked a direction away from both sets of footprints and set off, my borrowed flashlight barely penetrating the swirling snow. As I trudged through the deep drifts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every snapping twig the prelude to an attack. But I kept going, driven by the need to put as much distance between myself and that cabin of horrors as possible. I walked through the night, the adrenaline keeping me warm and alert, as the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the clouds. I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the distant rumble of a snowplow on a main road. Stumbling towards the sound, I finally broke through the tree line. A highway stretched before me, the plow just visible in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, relief washing over me as it slowed to a stop. As the driver helped me into the cab, bombarding me with questions, I caught one last glimpse of the forest behind me. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. I knew that even though I'd escaped, the nightmare wasn't over. Those cabins were still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim. And as the plow carried me back to civilization, I made a silent vow. I would return, this time prepared. Whatever horrors lurked in those mountains, whatever twisted individuals preyed on innocent hikers, they would be exposed. The hunter's game was over. It was time they became the hunted. Story 3. The seagull's cry pierced the air, startling me awake. For a moment, I forgot where I was, the unfamiliar ceiling above me a blank canvas for my disorientation. Then it all came rushing back. The beach house, our romantic getaway, and the growing certainty that we were being watched. I turned to wake Sarah, but her side of the bed was empty, the sheets cold. My heart began to race as I called out her name, met only by the distant crash of waves and that same mocking seagull. It had all started so perfectly. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months, a chance to reconnect and escape the pressures of our busy lives in the city. When we found the listing for a secluded beach house on a private stretch of coastline, it seemed too good to be true. The photo showed a charming, weathered structure perched on stilts above the sand, with panoramic views of the ocean from every window. The drive down had been filled with laughter and easy conversation, the kind we hadn't shared in far too long. As we wound our way down the coastal road, the sea stretching endlessly to our left, I felt the tension of the past few months melting away. Sarah's hand found mine across the center console, and I remember thinking that everything was going to be all right. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky a riot of oranges and pinks reflected in the calm water. The beach house was everything we'd hoped for, rustic but comfortable, with a wide deck that seemed to float above the sand. We spent that first evening unpacking, cooking a simple dinner, and sharing a bottle of wine as we watched the stars come out. It was on our second day that I first noticed something odd. We'd spent the morning walking along the beach, collecting shells and stealing kisses like teenagers. As we made our way back to the house, I saw a group of people standing at the edge of the property, where our private stretch of sand met the public beach. There were 5 of them, men and women of various ages, all staring intently in our direction. "Sarah," I said, nudging her, "do you see those people?" She followed my gaze and frowned. "Huh?" "Maybe they're just curious about the house. It is pretty spectacular." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. But as we climbed the steps to the deck, I glanced back. They were still there, watching. Throughout the afternoon, I kept catching glimpses of them. Sometimes it was the whole group, sometimes just 1 or 2, but they were always there, always watching. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just locals curious about the out-of-towners, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That evening, as we sat on the deck watching the sunset, Sarah suddenly gripped my arm. "Jack," she whispered, "look." I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. The watchers were lined up along the edge of the water, barely visible in the fading light. But what sent a shiver down my spine was that they were all facing the house, standing perfectly still as the waves lapped at their feet. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Maybe we should call the rental company." I nodded, already pulling out my phone. But as I dialed, a message flashed on the screen. "No service." "That's weird," I muttered. I had signal earlier. Sarah checked her phone too, with the same result. We went inside, locking the doors and drawing the curtains. I tried the landline, but it was dead. A quick check of the router showed the internet was out too. We were cut off. "It's probably just a temporary outage," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's get some sleep. Everything will look better in the morning." But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house settling, every distant sound had me on edge. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with faceless figures standing in the surf, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. The next morning, we woke to find our car wouldn't start. The battery was completely dead, despite being nearly new. As I stared at the useless engine, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The watchers were back, scattered along the beach, their eyes never leaving us. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This isn't right," I nodded, my mind racing. The nearest town was about 5 miles down the coast. We could walk it, but it would mean passing by the watchers. We packed quickly, throwing essentials into our backpacks. As we stepped out onto the deck, I tried to project confidence I didn't feel. "We're just going to walk right past them," I said quietly to Sarah. "Don't make eye contact, don't engage. Just keep moving." She nodded, her hand gripping mine tightly as we made our way down to the sand. The watchers seemed to part as we approached, creating a path but never taking their eyes off us. Up close, I could see the details I'd missed from a distance. The weathered faces, the salt-stained clothes, the eerie blankness in their stares. We were about halfway through their loose formation when one of them spoke. It was an older woman, her silver hair whipping in the sea breeze. "You can't leave," she said, her voice as dry and rough as sand. "The tide is coming in." I felt Sarah stiffen beside me, but we kept walking. Another voice, this time a young man to our right. "The shore claims what's his." "You're his now." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the waves over the rush of blood in my ears. We quickened our pace, almost running now. Suddenly, they were all speaking, a cacophony of voices repeating the same phrases over and over. The tide is coming. You're his now. You can't leave. We broke into a full sprint, kicking up sand as we raced down the beach. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The watchers were following, not running, but walking with a terrible, inexorable purpose. We ran until our lungs burned, the beach house long out of sight behind us. Finally, we stumbled to a stop, gasping for air. The watchers were nowhere to be seen, but their words echoed in my mind. The tide is coming. You're his now.
Jack, Sarah panted, pointing ahead. Look, in the distance, I could see buildings.
The town. Relief flooded through me, giving me a second wind. Come on, I said, we're almost there. But as we drew closer, my relief turned to ash. The buildings were abandoned, windows boarded up, streets empty. It looked like no one had lived here for years. This isn't possible, Sarah whispered. The listing said there was a town nearby. We passed through it on the way here. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I remembered the drive down. Had we actually seen a town? Or had we just assumed there would be one? The sound of waves seemed louder now, more insistent. I turned back towards the ocean and felt the blood drain from my face. The tide was coming in, fast, much faster than it should have been. The water was already halfway up the beach, frothing and churning like something alive. And there, standing in the surf, were the watchers. Dozens of them now, stretching as far as the eye could see in both directions, blocking any escape inland. Sarah, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Run. We turned and fled into the abandoned town, the sound of rushing water at our heels. We darted down empty streets, past derelict shops with faded signs, looking desperately for somewhere, anywhere that might offer shelter or escape. Finally, we burst through the rotting door of what must have once been a small church. As we slammed it shut behind us, I could hear the water lapping at the steps outside. Jack, Sarah sobbed, clinging to me. What's happening? What are we going to do? I held her tightly, my mind racing. There had to be a way out, some explanation for all of this. As I opened my mouth to reassure her, to say anything that might calm her fears, I felt it. A drop of water, cold as death, landing on my cheek. I looked up slowly, already knowing what I would see. The ceiling was leaking, water pouring in through a dozen small holes. And in that water, I could see faces, watching, waiting. The tide had come for us, and we were his now. As the water rose around our ankles, I clung to Sarah, our eyes locked on the door. We both knew what we would see when it inevitably burst open. The watchers would be there, ready to welcome us into their ranks. And somewhere behind them, something ancient and hungry that the shore had claimed long ago. The wood of the door began to splinter. Story 4. The bell above the diner door chimed, jolting me from my caffeine-induced trance. I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m., right on schedule. They filed in silently, 5 of them as always, and took their usual booth. I grabbed the coffee pot with a trembling hand, knowing that in serving them, I was sealing not just their fate, but the fate of our entire town. My name's Alex, and until 3 weeks ago, I was just a regular night shift worker at Dot's Diner. A 24-hour greasy spoon on the outskirts of Millhaven, population 4,283. Well, 4,278 now, if you count the disappearances. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started on a Tuesday night, or Wednesday morning if you want to get technical. The graveyard shift at Dots was usually quiet. A few truckers stopping for coffee, maybe some kids after a late night party. Nothing I couldn't handle while half asleep. That night, though, something felt off from the moment I clocked in. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder than usual. I chalked it up to an oncoming migraine and popped an aspirin. At precisely 3 a.m., they walked in. 2 women and 3 men. All in nondescript clothing that somehow managed to look both brand new and decades old at the same time. They sat in the corner booth without a word, their movements synchronized in a way that made my skin crawl. I approached with my usual cheery, "Welcome to Dots. What can I get you?" They looked up in unison, their eyes reflecting the harsh diner lights like animals caught in headlights. The woman closest to me spoke, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Coffee, black. 5 cups. I nodded, trying to hide my unease, and retreated to the safety of the counter. As I poured their coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not just by them, but by something else. Something lurking just beyond the grimy diner windows. When I brought their coffee, they were huddled close, whispering intently. I caught fragments of their conversation as I approached. "The seal is weakening. Need more time? Sacrifices must be made." They fell silent as I set down their cups, 5 pairs of eyes boring into me. I managed a weak smile and scurried back to the counter, my heart pounding. For the next hour, they sat there, sipping their coffee with mechanical precision, never speaking above a whisper. At exactly 4 a.m., they stood as one and left, leaving crisp bills under their untouched cups. I breathed a sigh of relief as the door swung shut behind them. But as I went to clear their table, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bills they'd left were perfect. Too perfect. The kind of flawless currency you'd see in a movie prop room, not in real life. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just some weird customers with counterfeit money. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night, it happened again. 3 a.m. on the dot, they walked in. Same booth, same order, same whispered conversations. And at 4 a.m., they left the same too perfect money. This continued for a week, each night exactly the same. I started dreading the approach of 3 a.m., my stomach knotting with anxiety as the hour drew near. It was on the 8th night that things changed. As I poured their coffee, my hand shaking so badly I nearly spilled it, the woman who always spoke leaned in close. Her breath was ice cold against my ear as she whispered, "It's coming. You can't stop it, but you can join us." I jerked back, nearly dropping the coffee pot. They all stared at me, their eyes now solid black, reflecting nothing. I stammered something about needing to check on another customer. The diner was empty, and practically ran back to the counter. The next morning, I heard the news. Old Mrs. Hendricks, who lived down the street from the diner, had disappeared in the night. The police found her front door wide open, her TV still on, but no sign of a struggle. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it had something to do with my late-night customers. But who would believe me? I was just the night shift kid at a rundown diner. Over the next 2 weeks, 4 more people vanished. Each disappearance corresponded with one of my mysterious customers. The elderly man with the permanent scowl, the woman with the long red hair, the heavy-set guy with the crew cut, and the young woman who never seemed to blink. And each night, they came to the diner. Each night, they whispered about seals and sacrifices and something coming. And each night, that woman would lean in close and repeat her chilling invitation. I tried to warn people. I went to the police, but they dismissed me as an overworked kid with an overactive imagination. I tried to talk to my co-workers, my friends, but they all looked at me like I was losing it. Maybe I was. Last night was the breaking point. As I drove to work, the streets of Millhaven felt wrong. Houses that I'd known my entire life suddenly seemed unfamiliar, their angles just slightly off. The few people I saw walking around moved stiffly, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. I almost turned around, almost called in sick, but I knew they would be waiting for me. And somehow, I knew that my presence was the only thing holding back whatever was trying to break through. So here I am, pouring coffee for these things that wear human faces, listening to them whisper about the end of everything I've ever known. The woman leans in, right on cue. "It's almost here," she hisses, her breath colder than ever. "Last chance. Join us or join them." I step back, my decision made. "I'll never join you," I say, my voice steadier than I feel. She smiles, a terrible stretching of lips that reveals too many teeth. "Then you've sealed your fate." And theirs. As if on cue, the diner's lights flicker. Outside, an unnatural darkness begins to creep across the sky, swallowing the stars. The air grows thick, making it hard to breathe. My 5 customers stand, their movements no longer in sync but jerky and inhuman. Their faces begin to shift, features melting and reforming into something my mind can't or won't comprehend. I back away, bumping into the counter. The coffee pot falls from my nerveless fingers, shattering on the linoleum. The sound seems to trigger something. The thing that was once a woman lunges for me, its arm elongating impossibly to bridge the distance between us. I duck, more out of instinct than any real hope of escape. Its clawed hand misses me by inches, raking deep gouges in the countertop. The bell above the door chimes again, and I risk a glance towards the sound. My heart leaps as I see Frank, our short-wadder, cook, standing there. For a moment, I think I'm saved. But then I see his eyes, solid black, just like theirs. "No," I whisper, the last shred of hope dying in my chest. Frank's face splits in a grin too wide for his skull, and he speaks in a voice that sounds like 1,000 whispers layered over each other. The seal is broken. He comes. The darkness outside rushes in, shattering the diner's windows and extinguishing all light. I feel cold. Writhing things brush against me in the pitch black, and I scream. Suddenly, everything stops. The darkness recedes, pooling in the corners of the diner. My 5 customers are gone, leaving no trace they were ever there. Frank is slumped against the door, looking confused and very human. "Alex," he mumbles, "what's going on? Why are the windows broken?" I open my mouth to answer, but no words come out. How can I explain what just happened? How can I tell him that for weeks I've been serving coffee to things that weren't human? That I've been an unwitting gatekeeper to some cosmic horror? As I struggle to find words, I notice something on the table where they always sat. It's a newspaper, one that definitely wasn't there before. The date on it makes my heart stop. It's tomorrow's paper. With shaking hands, I unfold it. The headline screams up at me in bold type. "Entire town vanishes overnight. -4,278 missing." No explanation, I look up, meeting Frank's confused gaze. Outside, I can hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. The first rays of dawn are peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It looks like the beginning of a beautiful day. But I know better. This isn't a beginning. It's an end. And as I hear car doors slamming outside, as I see men in dark suits approaching the diner, I realize that my shift isn't over. It's only just begun. Story 5. The moment I stepped into the master bedroom, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was actively trying to push me out. But that was impossible, wasn't it? I was a real estate agent, for crying out loud. Haunted houses were for horror movies, not for luxury listings in the Hollywood Hills. If I'd only listened to that feeling, if I'd just turned around and walked out, maybe they'd all still be alive. My name is Megan Reeves, and until yesterday, I was living the California dream. Top-selling agent at Sunset Realty, a condo in West Hollywood, and a string of successful open houses that had my competitors green with envy. But now, as I sit in this interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent lights making my head pound, I realize how quickly dreams can turn into nightmares. It all started with a phone call. Bernard Kingsley, one of the wealthiest tech moguls in Silicon Valley, wanted to sell his Los Angeles vacation home. The commission alone would set me up for years. I jumped at the chance, practically tasting the victory champagne as I scheduled the open house. The property was breathtaking, a sprawling modernist masterpiece perched on a cliff. All glass and sharp angles with a view that made you feel like you were floating above the city. As I walked through it that first time, making notes and planning the staging, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. It was like being watched, but more than that, like the house itself was aware. I brushed it off as nerves. This was the biggest listing of my career, after all. But as I prepared for the open house, little things kept happening. Items I'd carefully arranged would be in different positions when I returned to a room. Doors I was sure I'd left open would be closed. Once, I could have sworn I heard whispers coming from an empty bedroom. The day of the open house arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. I'd invited only the most exclusive clients, CEOs, celebrities, old money families. As they began to arrive, I plastered on my best smile and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. "Welcome to 1420 Sunset Plaza Drive," I said to each group as they entered. "Please, feel free to explore. I'll be happy to answer any questions." For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The guests wandered through the house, admiring the architecture and the views. I overheard snippets of conversation about potential offers, and my spirits lifted. This was going to be a success, after all. Then I noticed the first oddity. A couple I'd greeted earlier was standing in the foyer, staring blankly at the wall. When I approached them, they didn't respond. Their eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Are you all right?" I asked, touching the woman's arm gently. She turned to me slowly, her movements jerky like a marionette. When she spoke, her voice was flat, emotionless. "It's perfect. We'll take it." Before I could respond, they turned and walked out the front door in perfect synchronization. I stood there, stunned, as they got into their car and drove away. That's when I realized the house had gone silent. No more chatter, no clinking of champagne glasses, just an oppressive, heavy silence. Heart pounding, I made my way through the house. In every room, I found people frozen in place, staring at nothing. Some were smiling vacantly, others looked terrified, but none of them responded to my increasingly frantic attempts to get their attention. In the master bedroom, I found Mr. Williamson, a well-known film producer, writing feverishly on the wall with what looked like blood. As I got closer, I realized with horror that he was using his own fingernails, now torn and bleeding, to carve a single phrase over and over. The house hung as I ran, out of the bedroom, down the stairs, my heels clicking frantically on the polished concrete floors. But when I reached the foyer, I found the front door closed, locked. I yanked at the handle, threw my body against the unyielding wood, but it wouldn't budge. A sound behind me made me whirl around. The guests were descending the stairs, moving in that same jerky, puppet-like way. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. "What do you want?" I screamed, pressing my back against the door. "What's happening?" A voice answered, but it didn't come from any of the people. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a deep, resonant tone that I felt more than heard. "I want to live," it said, "and you have brought me such a feast." The guests moved closer, their hands outstretched. I noticed with growing horror that their fingers were elongating, nails sharpening into claws. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I ran for the kitchen, remembering a door that led to the pool area. Behind me, I could hear the shuffling gait of the guests getting closer. I burst through the kitchen door and out onto the pool deck. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. In any other circumstance, it would have been beautiful. Now, it felt like a mocking reminder of the normalcy I'd left behind when I entered this house. The pool stretched before me, its still surface reflecting the darkening sky. Beyond it was a gate that led to the driveway. Freedom. I started to run around the pool's edge. Suddenly, hands burst from the water, grabbing at my ankles. I screamed, losing my balance and falling hard on the deck. As I scrambled backward, I saw faces in the water, the missing couple from earlier, and others I didn't recognize. Their eyes were pleading, mouths open and silent screams. The voice spoke again, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You can't leave, Megan. The house has chosen you. You brought them to me, and now you'll watch as I consume them. As I consume you." The guests poured out of the house, surrounding the pool. Their bodies were changing, flesh rippling and reforming into grotesque shapes. They moved towards me with a terrible purpose. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for the edge of the property, where the manicured lawn gave way to the steep hillside. Without hesitation, I threw myself over, tumbling down the slope. Pain exploded through my body as I hit rocks and scrub brush. I could hear inhuman shrieks of rage from above, growing fainter as I fell further. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a stop at the bottom of the hill, battered and bleeding but alive. I looked up at the house, now a looming silhouette against the night sky. There was movement in the windows, shapes that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. And I swear, just for a moment, I saw the entire structure shift, like it was settling after a large meal. Somehow, I made it to the road. A passing car stopped, an elderly couple peering out at me with concern. As they called an ambulance, I babbled my story, fully aware of how insane it sounded. The police didn't believe me, of course. How could they? When they went to investigate, they found the house empty. No sign of the guests, no blood on the walls, nothing out of place. Just a beautiful, empty house with a for sale sign out front. They think I'm crazy. That I had some kind of breakdown and imagined the whole thing. Maybe they're right. Maybe the stress finally got to me and I snapped. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And as I sit here in this sterile room, waiting for the psychiatrist they've assigned to me, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Because the house is still out there, still hungry, and I'm the only one who knows the truth. I just pray that someone believes me before it's too late. Before some other unsuspecting real estate agent schedules an open house, bringing a fresh feast to that monstrous structure on the hill. Because in Los Angeles, the land of dreams and nightmares, there's always someone looking for the perfect home. And 1420 Sunset Plaza Drive is waiting, its doors open wide, ready to welcome them in. God help us all. Story 6. The crumbling welcome sign loomed out of the fog, its faded letters barely legible. Welcome to Millbrook, where everyone knows your name. I snorted, nudging my boyfriend Jake. Yeah, because there's probably like 10 people who live here. Little did I know that in a few hours, I'd be praying to whatever God would listen that there were only 10 people in Millbrook, and that they were actually people at all. It was supposed to be a fun detour on our road trip across the country. Jake and I, fresh out of college, had decided to take the summer to explore before diving into our new jobs in the fall. We'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway broken only by the occasional gas station or fast food joint. "Hey, Liv," Jake said, peering at his phone. "There's this old town coming up. Millbrook. Supposed to be like this hidden gem. Wanna check it out?" I shrugged, always up for an adventure. "Sure, why not? Maybe they'll have a decent place to grab lunch." As we turned off the highway, the fog rolled in, thick and soupy. Jake slowed the car to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. "Weird," he muttered. Forecast didn't say anything about fog. The town materialized out of the mist like something from an old movie. Quaint buildings lined the main street, their paint peeling but still charming. Vintage cars were parked along the curb, so perfectly preserved they looked like props. "Whoa," I breathed. "It's like we drove back in time." We parked in front of what looked like a diner, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the grey light. As we stepped out of the car, I was struck by the silence. No birds, no distant traffic, not even the hum of electricity. Just nothing. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice seeming to be swallowed by the fog. No response. We pushed open the diner door, a bell tinkling overhead. The interior was immaculate, red vinyl booths gleaming, chrome fixtures polished to a high shine, but empty. Completely empty. "Okay, this is weird," I said, a chill running down my spine despite the warm day. "Where is everyone?" Jake shrugged, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Maybe it's like siesta time or something." We decided to explore further, hoping to find signs of life. The fog seemed to thicken as we walked, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Each building we passed was the same, perfectly maintained, but utterly deserted. "Jake," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "I think we should go." He nodded, looking relieved. "Yeah, this place is giving me the creeps." "Let's head back to the car." But as we turned around, I felt my heart drop. The fog had closed in behind us, obscuring the way we'd come. I couldn't even see the next building, let alone our car. "It's okay," Jake said, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "We'll just backtrack slowly. The car can't be far." We walked for what felt like hours, but the scenery never changed. The same storefront, the same street lamp, over and over, like we were trapped in some kind of loop. "This is impossible," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. We should have reached the edge of town by now. That's when we heard it. A whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent shivers down my spine. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice echoing strangely in the fog. "Is someone there?" The whispers grew louder, coming from all around us now. I pressed closer to Jake, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist. An old woman, her face deeply lined, eyes milky with cataracts. She smiled, revealing blackened teeth. "Welcome to Millbrook, dearies," she cackled, her voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "We've been waiting for you." More figures appeared, surrounding us. Men, women, children, all with that same vacant smile and clouded eyes. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. Jake grabbed my hand. "Run!" he yelled, pulling me down a side street. We ran blindly through the fog, the whispers growing to a crescendo behind us. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The figures weren't running, but they were gaining on us, their bodies distorting in impossible ways as they moved. We burst into what looked like a town square, a large clock tower looming over us. The hands on the clock spun wildly, moving backwards and forwards at dizzying speeds. "The car," Jake shouted, pointing. Our renter was there, right in the middle of the square, though I could have sworn it wasn't there a moment ago. We sprinted for it, fumbling with the keys. As Jake struggled to start the engine, I looked out the window and froze. The townspeople had surrounded us, pressing against the car, their faces distorted into grotesque, leering masks. The engine roared to life, and Jake floored it. We plowed through the crowd, but instead of the sickening thud I expected, it felt like we were driving through thick syrup. The figures parted around us like smoke, reforming behind us as we passed. "Which way is out?" I screamed, trying to see through the impenetrable fog. "I don't know," Jake yelled back, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "Every turn looks the same." We drove in circles, each street identical to the last. The gas gauge dropped steadily, and a new fear gripped me. What would happen when we ran out of gas? As if reading my mind, Jake said, "We need to find another way out. On foot, maybe we can find a path the car can't take." I nodded, not trusting my voice. We slowed to a stop, and for a moment, we just sat there, listening. The whispers were all around us, but distant. "For now." "Okay," Jake said, taking a deep breath. "We go together, no matter what." "Deal, deal," I whispered, squeezing his hand. We stepped out of the car, immediately enveloped by the thick fog. I could barely see Jake next to me. We picked a direction at random and started walking. The town seemed to shift around us. Buildings appeared and disappeared in the mist. Streets rearranged themselves. More than once, I could have sworn I saw shadowy figures darting just out of sight. "Look!" Jake suddenly exclaimed, pointing ahead. "I think I see the edge of town." I squinted through the fog. There, in the distance, I could make out what looked like open fields beyond the last row of buildings. Hope surged through me. We quickened our pace, the edge of town growing closer. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but we ignored them, focused only on escape. Just as we reached the last building, a general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign, a voice rang out, clear as a bell. "And where do you think you're going?" We spun around. The old woman from before stood there, but she'd changed. Her skin was grey and rotting, her eyes now empty sockets. When she smiled, I saw that her teeth were sharp, filed 2 points. "Millbrook needs new blood," she hissed, her voice echoing strangely. "It's been so long since we had visitors." The fog around us came alive, coalescing into the shapes of the townspeople. But now I could see them for what they really were. Twisted, monstrous things that only vaguely resembled humans. "Run," I screamed, pulling Jake towards the town's edge. We sprinted, the sounds of pursuit right behind us. We burst through the last row of buildings, expecting to feel grass under our feet. Instead, we found ourselves back in the town square, the clock tower looming over us mockingly. "No," Jake moaned. "It's not possible." The townspeople closed in, their bodies shifting and melting together into a nightmarish mass. The old woman's voice echoed from everywhere at once. "Welcome to Millbrook," she cackled. "You're home now." I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But instead, I heard a distant sound. A horn. My eyes snapped open. We were in our car, parked on the side of the highway. A truck blared its horn as it passed us, the driver giving us an annoyed look. Jake sat up groggily beside me. What happened?" I looked around wildly. No fog, no town, just the open highway stretching out before and behind us. I don't know," I stammered. "A dream." But we both. Jake's face was pale. "Millbrook," he whispered. It felt so real. I nodded, my heart still racing. That's when I noticed something on the dashboard. A small antique clock, its hands spinning backwards. Something I knew for certain hadn't been there before. As I reached for it, it vanished, like smoke in the wind. But in its place was a small, handwritten note. "Come back soon. Millbrook is always waiting." Jake and I looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between us. Without a word, he started the car, and we sped away, never looking back. But even now, months later, I still sometimes hear those whispers in my dreams. And I know, with a bone-deep certainty, that somewhere out there, hidden in the fog, Millbrook is waiting. Waiting for us to make a wrong turn, to seek shelter from a storm, to decide on one more adventure. And next time, I don't think it will let us leave. Story 7. The first arrows whistled past my head as the sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the river into twilight. I ducked, nearly capsizing my kayak, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to be on a peaceful solo expedition, not fighting for my life in a maze of waterways that seemed to actively resist my escape. As night fell and inhuman shrieks echoed through the mist, I realized with growing horror that I might never find my way out of this watery labyrinth alive. My name is Sarah Chun, and 3 days ago, I was just another burnt-out software engineer looking for an adventure. I'd been planning this kayaking trip down the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea for months, poring over maps and travel blogs, determined to push myself to my limits. The travel agent had warned me about going solo, but I brushed off her concerns. I was experienced, I was prepared, and most importantly, I was desperate to prove to myself that I could do this. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. The river was challenging but beautiful, winding through lush rainforest, teeming with exotic wildlife. I made good progress, camping on the banks each night, falling asleep to a symphony of insects and distant animal calls. It was on the 3rd day that things started to go wrong. I woke to find the river had risen dramatically overnight, obliterating the landmarks I'd been using to navigate. The normally clear water was now a muddy brown, swirling with debris. But I was too stubborn, too proud to turn back. I told myself it was just a minor setback and pushed on. As the day wore on, a heavy mist settled over the water, reducing visibility to mere feet. The river seemed to widen, splitting into countless channels that all looked maddeningly similar. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only static. My compass spun wildly, as if confused by some magnetic anomaly. Panic began to set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. The towering trees on either bank all looked the same, their gnarled roots reaching into the water like grasping fingers. I paddled harder, ignoring the burning in my muscles, desperate to find something, anything, familiar. That's when I saw them. Dark shapes moving on the shore, just at the edge of the mist. At first, I thought they were animals, maybe wild pigs or cassowaries. But as I drew closer, I realized with a jolt that they were human. Or at least, humanoid. They were tall, much taller than any people I'd ever seen. Their bodies lean and covered in intricate patterns that I first mistook for tattoos. But as one turned to look directly at me, I realized with a wave of nausea that the patterns were moving, writhing across their skin like living things. I froze, my paddle half raised, caught between fear and disbelief. The figure on the shore tilted its head, regarding me with eyes that gleamed an unnatural yellow in the fading light. Then, with a motion almost too fast to follow, it raised a long, crooked bow. The first arrow missed me by inches, snapping me out of my paralysis. I dug my paddle into the water, propelling myself away as fast as I could. More arrows followed, some so close I could hear them cutting through the air. I rounded a bend in the river, momentarily losing sight of my pursuers. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around me in patterns that made my head spin. Strange sounds echoed through the gathering darkness, clicks and whistles that reminded me of dolphin calls, but distorted, almost mocking. As night fell, the river came alive with bioluminescence, casting an eerie blue glow over everything. In any other circumstance, it would have been beautiful. Now, it only served to make me feel more exposed, a glowing target in a sea of shadows. I paddled for what felt like hours, my arms burning, my mind racing. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow on the shore looked like a threat. The river seemed to be playing tricks on me. Channels that should have led to open water instead bringing me back to the same spots over and over. It was nearing midnight when I heard the drums. A deep, pulsing rhythm that I felt in my bones more than heard. It was coming from somewhere ahead, and despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I found myself drawn towards it. The river widened into a large lagoon, the shore lined with what looked like ancient stone structures, half submerged and covered in vines. And there, in the center of the lagoon, was an island. Or at least, I thought it was an island until it moved. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was enormous, easily the size of a blue whale, but shaped all wrong. Multiple limbs broke the surface, writhing slowly in a way that made my stomach churn. In the bioluminescent water, I could see more shapes moving beneath the surface, some as large as my kayak. On the shore, figures had begun to emerge from the mist. Dozens, then hundreds of the tall, alien beings, their skin patterns glowing in sync with the pulsing drums. They lined the water's edge, watching me with those eerie yellow eyes. I was trapped. To go forward was certain death, but I knew instinctively that trying to turn back would be just as fatal. As I hovered there, Paralyzed with indecision, I felt something brush against my kayak. Looking down, I saw a hand. A human hand, pale and bloated, reaching up from the depths. I bit back a scream as more appendages emerged. Hands, feet, even faces, all in various states of decay. They grabbed at my kayak, trying to pull me under. In blind panic, I swung my paddle, beating at the grasping limbs. But for each one I fought off, two more seemed to appear. I was being drawn inextricably towards the center of the lagoon, towards that massive, writhing shape. Just as I was certain I was about to be pulled under, a voice cut through the noise. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deep and resonant, yet somehow childlike in its curiosity. "Why do you struggle, little one?" it asked, the words forming in my mind rather than my ears. "The river has chosen you. It's an honor you receive." I looked up to see that the massive shape had moved closer. What I had taken for limbs, I now realized were tentacles, and nestled among them was something that might have been a face. Eyes larger than my entire body blinked at me slowly. "Who? What are you?" I managed to gasp out. A sound like grinding boulders echoed across the water. It took me a moment to realize it was laughing. "I am the river," it said simply. "I am the mist and the mud, the water and the life within it. And you, little one, you are to be part of me." As it spoke, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The fear and panic melted away, replaced by a sense of peace I'd never known before. Part of me knew this was wrong, that I should be fighting, but that voice was growing fainter by the second. I found myself letting go of my paddle, watching with detached fascination as it drifted away. The hands from the water no longer seemed threatening, but welcoming, gently tugging me towards my new home. As I slipped into the warm, embracing water, I had one last moment of clarity. I thought of my life back home, of the family and friends I'd left behind. Would they ever know what happened to me? Would they search, only to be drawn into the river's grasp themselves? But then the water closed over my head, and those thoughts faded away. I felt myself changing, my body dissolving and reforming into something new, something that belonged to the river. The last thing I saw before my eyes changed too much to process human vision was the night sky above, the stars wheeling in patterns I'd never noticed before. I am still here, in a sense. Part of me remembers being Sarah Chun, remembers a world beyond the river. But those memories grow fainter with each passing day. Now, I am the current and the eddies. I am the mist that confuses and the lights that lure. And when I see a lone kayaker, lost and afraid in our domain, I reach out with hands that are no longer quite human. After all, the river is always hungry for new souls, and I am the river. Story 8. The mummy's eyes snapped open, just as I was making my final rounds. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling on its desiccated face. This was impossible. I'd walked past this exhibit 100 times in the past month, and it had always been the same lifeless artifact. But now, as the ancient eyes focused on me with terrifying intelligence, I realized that nothing in this museum was what it seemed, and I was trapped inside until dawn. My name is Mike Connolly, and up until tonight, I thought I had the easiest job in the world. Night security guard at the Wilkinson Museum of Natural History. 8 hours of wandering empty holes, checking locks, and making sure the most exciting thing that happened was maybe a rat getting into the paleontology wing. The job had been a godsend after I got laid off from the factory. Sure, The pay wasn't great, but it was steady work, and I'd always been a bit of a history buff. Plus, having the run of a world-class museum all to myself every night, it was like a dream come true. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. I'd make my rounds, marveling at the dinosaur skeletons in the main hall, while stopping to admire the intricate details of the dioramas in the cultural exhibits. Sometimes I'd even put on my headphones and have a little dance party in the empty galleries. Who was going to see me, right? But then, about a month into the job, I started noticing things. Small things at first, easy to brush off. An artifact that seemed to be in a slightly different position than I remembered from the night before. The faint sound of whispers echoing through the Egyptian wing when I knew I was alone. A sense of being watched that would make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself I was imagining things, that the long, quiet nights were just getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It all came to a head tonight. I'd just started my shift, settling into the security office with a thermos of coffee and a dog-eared paperback. The bank of monitors in front of me showed the usual scenes: empty halls, dimly lit galleries, motionless exhibits. I was about halfway through my coffee when I noticed it. On the monitor showing the Native American exhibit, something moved. Just a flicker, so quick I almost missed it. I leaned in, squinting at the screen. For a long moment, nothing. Then, just as I was about to write it off as a trick of the light, I saw it again. One of the mannequins in the display, dressed in elaborate tribal regalia, had turned its head. My blood ran cold. This had to be a prank, right? Maybe one of the day staff had set up some animatronics as a joke. But as I watched, the figure moved again, taking a halting step forward. Then another, and another. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, my heart pounding as I rushed to the exhibit. This wasn't funny anymore. Someone was in the museum, messing with the displays. I'd caught them red-handed, and I was going to. I skidded to a stop at the entrance to the Native American wing, my words dying in my throat. The exhibit was empty. The mannequin that I'd seen moving on the camera was back in its original position, as still and lifeless as ever. But something was different. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The mannequin's head was turned, its painted eyes staring directly at me. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had to be seeing things. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the monitors, and this was all some vivid dream. A sound behind me made me whirl around. In the hall of medieval artifacts, a suit of armor was moving, its metal joints creaking as it took slow, ponderous steps towards me. I ran. Through the halls of ancient Greece, past statues whose heads turned to follow my progress. Into the wing dedicated to early hominids, where the once motionless figures of Neanderthals and Homo erectus were stirring, reaching out with grasping hands as I passed. I found myself in the main hall, surrounded by the looming skeletons of dinosaurs. My ragged breathing echoed in the cavernous space, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard it. The sound of massive bones creaking and grinding against each other. Slowly, I looked up. The T-Rex skeleton, its mouth full of knife-like teeth, was lowering its head towards me. Its empty eye sockets somehow managed to convey hunger. I don't remember deciding to move. One moment, I was frozen in terror. The next, I was sprinting towards the Egyptian wing. It was the closest thing to a defensible position I could think of. Lots of sarcophagi I could maybe barricade myself in if I had to. That's how I ended up here, face to face with a mummy that should be long dead, but was somehow awake and aware. Its withered hand reached for me, papery skin rustling. I stumbled backward, knocking into a display case. Something clattered to the floor, an ornate golden amulet. Without thinking, I snatched it up. The moment my fingers closed around the amulet, everything stopped. The mummy froze in place, its hands still outstretched. The sounds of movement from the other exhibits ceased. For a long moment, the only sound was my own panicked breathing. Then, a voice spoke, not out loud, but in my head. Ancient and powerful, it reverberated through my entire being. Who dares to wield the amulet of Anubis? I looked down at the object in my hand. The amulet was warm, almost seeming to pulse with energy. I'm Mike, the night guard. What's happening? What is this thing? A sound like dry laughter echoed in my mind. The night guard. How fitting. You stand at the threshold between the world of the living and the realm of history and myth, and now you hold the key to both. The voice, which I was beginning to suspect belonged to Anubis himself, explained. The amulet was an artifact of immense power, capable of bringing the past to life. For centuries, it had lain dormant in the museum, its power held in check by the natural order of things. But tonight, for reasons unknown, the power had awakened. The veil between worlds has thinned, Anubis intoned. The past seeks to reclaim its place in the present. You, Night Guard, must decide. Will you use the amulet to restore the barrier, or will you let history run free? My mind reeled. This was insane. I was a factory worker turned security guard, not some chosen one with the fate of the world in my hands. But as I looked around at the frozen tableaus of once living history, I knew I couldn't just walk away. What do I need to do? I asked. Anubis explained the ritual. I had to visit each of the major exhibits before dawn, using the amulet to reaffirm the separation between past and present. It wouldn't be easy. The moment I began, all the awakened exhibits would try to stop me, drawn to the power of the amulet. Taking a deep breath, I nodded. Okay, I'll do it. What followed was the most terrifying and exhilarating night of my life. I raced through the museum, the amulet glowing in my hand as I performed the ritual in each wing. Behind me, history literally came alive. I dodged spears thrown by Zulu warriors, ducked under the swinging fists of a Neanderthal, and narrowly avoided being trampled by a woolly mammoth. In the Hall of World Religions, I found myself in a pitched battle between Viking berserkers and samurai warriors. Through it all, I kept moving, kept chanting the words Anubis had taught me. With each completed ritual, I could feel the barrier between worlds strengthening. As I reached the main hall, the first light of dawn was starting to filter through the skylights. I had minutes left, at most. And between me and the final ritual site stood the T-Rex, its bones now covered in translucent flesh, yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intent. For a moment, I hesitated. I was no hero. I was just a guy who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe the right place at the right time. Either way, I was terrified. But then I thought about what would happen if I failed. This madness spilling out into the city, into the world. I couldn't let that happen. With a yell that surprised even me, I charged. The T-Rex lunged, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from me as I slid beneath it, scrambling towards the ritual site. I could feel its hot breath on my neck as I raised the amulet one last time, shouting the final words of the chant. A pulse of energy burst from the amulet, rippling through the museum. The T-Rex roared, the sound cutting off abruptly as it and every other animated exhibit froze in place. Slowly, they all began to fade, returning to their original, inanimate states. As the last of the living history disappeared, I collapsed to the floor, exhausted. The amulet slipped from my grasp, once again just a lifeless piece of jewelry. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake by the day manager. Mike, are you alright? What happened? I looked around, disoriented. The museum was back to normal. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and I could hear the distant sounds of the city waking up. Had it all been a dream? But then I felt something in my pocket. The amulet. And I knew that everything had been real. I looked up at the manager and managed a weak smile. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, but I think we might need to update the night guard's manual. As I was taken to the security office to write up an incident report, leaving out the more unbelievable details, I couldn't help but wonder, would it happen again? Was I now the designated guardian of the threshold between past and present? One thing was for sure. I'd never look at this museum, or history itself, the same way again. And as for tonight's shift, well, let's just say I'll be bringing an extra thermos of coffee. Something tells me I'm going to need it. Story 9. The scratching sounds from the basement grew louder, more frantic. I clutched Sarah's hand tighter as we huddled on the living room couch, our eyes fixed on the door at the bottom of the stairs. We'd moved into our dream home just 3 weeks ago, but tonight, that dream was quickly turning into a nightmare. As the door began to rattle on its hinges, I realized with growing horror that we weren't just dealing with a pest problem. Something was trying to get out of our basement, something that had been waiting a very long time for new occupants. My name is Daniel Cooper, and until tonight, I thought I had it all figured out. A successful career in finance, a beautiful wife, and now, our very own piece of suburban paradise. The Victorian-style house had been a steal, priced well below market value due to its need for some TLC. As the real estate agent had put it, Sarah and I saw it as an opportunity, a chance to build our future together while restoring a piece of history. The first week was a whirlwind of unpacking, painting, and planning renovations. We were so caught up in the excitement of home ownership that we barely noticed the little oddities. The occasional cold spot in the hallway. The way shadows seemed to linger a bit too long in corners. The faint whispers that might have been the wind, but sounded unsettlingly like muffled conversations. It was on our 8th night in the house that we first heard the noises from the basement. A soft thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sarah stirred beside me in bed, her voice thick with sleep. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, already reaching for the baseball bat I'd started keeping by the bed. Old houses made noise, I knew that. But this felt different. We crept down the stairs, the ancient wood creaking beneath our feet despite our best efforts to be quiet. The basement door loomed before us, a dark maw at the bottom of the staircase. As we approached, the noises stopped abruptly. I put my hand on the doorknob, cool metal sending a shiver up my arm. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open, flicking on the light switch in the same motion. The naked bulb flickered to life, illuminating. Nothing, just our basement, filled with unpacked boxes and the usual clutter of a new move. No signs of intruders, no evidence of anything that could have made those sounds. Sarah let out a nervous laugh. Maybe it was just the pipes settling. I nodded, not quite believing it but desperate for any rational explanation. Yeah, probably. Let's go back to bed. But as we turned to head back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. The incidents escalated over the next 2 weeks. Items would move on their own, always when our backs were turned, The temperature would plummet in certain rooms, our breath visible even as the thermostat read a balmy 72 degrees. And always, there were the noises from the basement. Scratching, thumping, and sometimes what sounded like muffled screams. We tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away. We were stressed from the move, from work, from the pressures of fixing up an old house. But deep down, we knew something was terribly wrong. It all came to a head tonight. We'd just finished dinner when the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate to the fuse box in the hallway. As I reached for the panel, a cold hand brushed against the back of my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, shadows dancing in the beam of my flashlight. That's when the scratching started. Louder than ever before, it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it vibrating with an otherworldly energy. Sarah's scream cut through the chaos. I ran back to the kitchen to find her pressed against the wall, pointing at the basement door. It was shaking violently, as if something on the other side was throwing its entire weight against it. We retreated to the living room, grabbing anything that could be used as a weapon. As we huddled on the couch, the scratching grew more intense, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. "Dan," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" Before I could answer, a new sound cut through the din. A voice, raspy and ancient, seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. "Welcome home," it hissed. "We've been waiting for you." The basement door exploded off its hinges, crashing into the opposite wall. In the doorway stood something. It was vaguely humanoid, but twisted and wrong in ways my mind struggled to comprehend. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible angles. Its skin was a patchwork of textures, here smooth as glass, there rough and bark-like. And its face, God, its face was a writhing mass of features, eyes and mouths appearing and disappearing like bubbles in boiling tar. Sarah's scream jolted me into action. I grabbed her hand and ran for the front door, my only thought to get us out of this nightmare. But as I reached for the handle, the door melted away, leaving only smooth, unbroken wall. The thing from the basement laughed, the sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. "There is no escape," it said, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. "This house has tasted your fear, your hopes, your dreams. It hungers for more." We backed away, pressing ourselves against the far wall of the living room. The creature advanced slowly, almost lazily, as if savoring our terror. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. It cocked its head, an eerily human gesture from something so monstrous. We want what we've always wanted. To live, to grow, to feed. As it spoke, I noticed something behind it. The walls of the house were changing. The floral wallpaper we'd so carefully chosen was bubbling and shifting, patterns swirling into faces frozen in silent screams. "You see it now," the creature said, noticing my gaze. "This house is alive. It has been for centuries, feeding on the lives and souls of those who dwell within it. And now, it's your turn." It lunged forward with impossible speed. I pushed Sarah behind me, prepared to fight, even though I knew it was hopeless. But just as the creature's clawed hand was about to reach us, it stopped. A look of confusion passed over its ever-changing face. It turned, looking back at the basement door. A soft golden light was emanating from below, growing brighter by the second. "No," the creature hissed. "It's not possible." The seal was broken. From the basement emerged a new figure. An old woman, her face lined with age, but her eyes bright with an inner fire. She held an ornate lantern in one gnarled hand, its light seeming to push back the darkness. "That's quite enough of that," she said, her voice strong and clear. "You've overstayed your welcome, spirit." The creature shrieked, a sound of pure rage and frustration. It tried to lunge at the old woman, but the light from her lantern held it at bay. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The old woman smiled kindly at us. "Just a caretaker, dear. Someone has to keep an eye on places like this, make sure the darkness doesn't get too bold." She turned her attention back to the creature, her expression hardening. "Now then, back to the depths with you. You know the rules." The creature let out one final, blood-curdling scream before dissolving into a mass of writhing shadows. These were sucked back into the basement, the door reappearing and slamming shut behind them. As suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The house was quiet, the walls once again covered in our cheerful floral wallpaper. Even the broken basement door had repaired itself. The old woman turned to us, her smile returning. "I'm sorry about that, dears. This old house gets ideas sometimes. Thinks it can break the covenant, reach beyond its bounds. I usually catch it before things get this far." I opened my mouth, closed it, then opened it again. 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but all I managed to say was, "What? What was that thing?" "A manifestation," she replied, as casually as if discussing the weather. "This house, like many old buildings, has a certain awareness. Usually, it's content to simply observe, maybe play a few harmless tricks, but sometimes it gets hungry. That's when I have to step in." Sarah found her voice. Are we safe now?" The old woman's expression softened. "For now, yes, but this house will always be what it is. It's up to you whether you want to stay." Knowing that, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. "If you decide to remain, keep this. It'll help keep the house's more aggressive tendencies in check. But be warned, living here means becoming part of its story. For better or worse." With that, she pressed the box into my hands and walked to the front door. It opened for her without a touch, and as she stepped through, she seemed to fade away like morning mist. Sarah and I stood in stunned silence for a long moment. Finally, I looked down at the box in my hands, then up at the house around us. Our dream home, now revealed to be so much more than we ever imagined. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice small but steady. I took a deep breath, weighing our options. We could leave, try to forget this ever happened, go back to our normal, safe lives. But as I looked around at the home we'd already put so much of ourselves into, I realized I wasn't ready to give up on our dream just yet. "We stay," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "This is our home now. And if it wants to be part of our story, well, we'll just have to make sure it's a good one." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Okay," she said, "but we're getting a really good security system. And maybe some sage. Lots of sage." As we laughed, the tension of the night finally breaking, I could have sworn I felt the house settle around us. Not menacingly, but almost. Contentedly, like it was sighing in relief. Our dream home might be more than we bargained for, but it was ours. And together, we'd face whatever stories it had in store for us. Story 10. The first drop of blood hit the windshield just as we crossed the state line. I glanced at my passenger, his gaunt face illuminated by the dashboard lights, and knew with sickening certainty that picking him up had been the biggest mistake of my life. As his thin lips curved into a smile that was more predatory than friendly, I realized that this long-haul trip was about to become a fight for survival. My name's Jack Thornton, and I've been driving trucks across the country for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen just about everything you can imagine on these long, lonely stretches of highway. Accidents, wild animals, strange lights in the sky. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that moonless night in the middle of nowhere. It started like any other haul. I was making my way from Albuquerque to Chicago, a route I'd driven so many times I could probably do it with my eyes closed. The radio was playing some old country tune, and I was idly tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, my mind wandering as the miles rolled by. That's when I saw him. A lone figure on the side of the road, thumb out, barely visible in my headlights. Now, I'm not usually one for picking up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories, too many risks. But something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the late hour, or the fact that we were miles from anywhere. Or maybe it was just that gnawing loneliness that sometimes creeps up on you during these long night drives. I pulled over, the air brakes hissing as the truck came to a stop. The man approached, his face hidden in the shadow of a worn baseball cap. He was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so, with clothes that hung off him like they were a size too big. "Where are you headed?" I called out the window. "Chicago," he replied, his voice a raspy whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. But I brushed it off. Guy probably just needed a drink of water. "Hop in," I said, reaching over to unlock the passenger door. "That's where I'm headed." He climbed in with a fluid grace that belied his gangly frame. As he settled into the seat beside me, I got my first good look at his face. Pale, almost grey in the dim light, with deep-set eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all. But his smile was wide and grateful, and I felt that initial unease start to fade. "Thanks for the ride," he said, extending a hand. "Name's Alan." I shook his hand, noting how cold his skin felt. "Jack. Nice to meet you, Alan." We set off, the big rig eating up the miles as we headed east. At first, the conversation was normal enough. Alan told me he was a freelance photographer on his way to Chicago for a job. I shared some stories from the road, the usual trucker tales of near misses and strange sights. But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. Alan's questions became more personal, more probing. He wanted to know about my family, my home, my fears, and the way, he asked, leaning in close, those black eyes boring into me, made my skin crawl. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but Alan always found a way to circle back. It was like he was mining me for information, searching for something specific. About 3 hours into the drive, I noticed Alan fidgeting more, his movements becoming jerky and unnatural. His head would twitch to the side at odd intervals, and his fingers drummed an erratic rhythm on the dashboard. "You okay there, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even as alarm bells started ringing in my head. Alan's head snapped towards me, so fast I could have sworn I heard his neck crack. "Just fine, Jack," he said, his voice deeper than before, with an odd resonance that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Just getting hungry." The way he said that last word sent a chill through me. I focused on the road ahead, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I saw it. A sign for a rest stop, coming up in 2 miles. Tell you what, I said, forcing a smile. Why don't we stop up ahead? Stretch our legs, maybe grab a snack. Alan's smile widened, showing teeth that looked just a bit too sharp in the dashboard light. Oh, I don't think that will be necessary, Jack. I have everything I need right here. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I realized the true horror of my situation. I was trapped in the cab with something that wasn't human, hurtling down a deserted highway at 70 miles an hour. That's when Alan moved. In a blur of motion, almost too fast to follow, he lunged across the cab, his body contorting in ways that no human body should. I felt a sharp pain in my arm and looked down to see blood welling up from a deep scratch. Instinct took over. I slammed on the brakes, the sudden deceleration throwing Alan off balance. He crashed into the windshield, leaving a spiderweb of cracks where his head impacted. But instead of being stunned, he laughed. A horrible, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Oh, Jack," he said, his voice now a multi-toned abomination. "You have no idea how long I've waited for a ride like this." As he spoke, his body began to change. His skin rippled and stretched, clothes staring as his form expanded. Limbs elongated, joints popping and reforming. His face. God, his face melted like wax, features rearranging themselves into something that barely resembled anything human. I fumbled for the door handle, my only thought to get out, to run, to escape this nightmare. But Alan, or the thing that had been Alan, was faster. A clawed hand shot out, pinning me to my seat. "Not so fast, Jack," it hissed, its breath hot and fetid on my face. We haven't even started the real journey yet. In desperation, I reached for the only weapon I had, a heavy flashlight I kept by my seat for emergencies. I swung it with all my might, connecting solidly with the creature's head. It reeled back, more in surprise than pain, but it was enough. I wrenched the door open and tumbled out onto the asphalt. The cold night air hit me like a slap, jolting me fully into fight or flight mode. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear it behind me, its feet, or whatever it was using to move, scraping on the road surface. Up ahead, I saw Salvation, the rest stop I'd noticed earlier. If I could just make it there, maybe I could find help, or at least somewhere to hide. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. The sound of pursuit grew closer, accompanied by a low, hungry growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. Just as I thought my legs would give out, I reached the rest stop. It was deserted, the vending machines and payphones standing like silent sentinels in the darkness. I made for the bathroom building, praying the door would be unlocked. It was. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me and frantically searching for a lock. There wasn't one. In desperation, I wedged myself against the door, using my body weight to hold it closed. For a long moment, there was silence. Had I lost it? Was I safe? Then, a scratch at the door. Soft at first, then more insistent. "Jack," Alan's voice called out, now a horrific parody of human speech. "Don't you want to complete our journey? I have so much to show you." I pressed harder against the door, feeling it shudder as something heavy threw itself against it from the other side. The thin wood wouldn't hold for long. My eyes darted around the small bathroom, looking for anything I could use as a weapon or a means of escape. That's when I saw it. A small window, high up on the wall. It would be a tight squeeze, but it was my only chance. I waited for the next impact against the door, then made a run for it. Jumping up, I managed to grab the windowsill and pull myself up. I could hear the door splintering behind me as I wriggled through the opening. I tumbled out onto the grass, the cool dew soaking through my shirt. Without pausing, I was up and running again, making for the highway. In the distance, I could see headlights approaching. Another truck. I ran into the road, waving my arms frantically. The truck blared its horn, brakes screeching as the driver fought to avoid hitting me. It came to a stop mere feet away. The driver, a burly man with a thick beard, leaned out the window. "What the hell, man? You trying to get yourself killed?" I opened my mouth to explain, to warn him, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly make him understand? That's when I heard it. That familiar, rasping laugh coming from just behind me. I turned slowly, dreading what I would see. There was Alan, looking completely normal again. No claws, no distorted features. Just a thin, harmless-looking man with a gentle smile. "There you are, Jack," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "I was worried when you ran off like that. Good thing I caught up with you." He turned to the truck driver. "Sorry about this. My friend here had a bit too much to drink at our last stop. Mind if we catch a ride with you? We're headed to Chicago." The driver looked between us, confusion and concern warring on his face. Sure, I guess. Hop in." As Alan walked towards the truck, he paused beside me. His eyes, for just a moment, flashed solid black. "Come on, Jack," he said, his voice pitched low so only I could hear. "We have a long way to go, and I'm still so very, very hungry." I stood there, frozen, as Alan climbed into the cab. The driver was looking at me expectantly. I knew I should run, should warn him, but where could I go? What could I say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman? With leaden feet, I walked to the truck. As I pulled myself up into the cab, I caught Alan's eye. He winked at me, that too wide smile spreading across his face. The truck pulled away, merging back onto the highway. As the miles began to roll by, I sat rigid in my seat, wondering how long this ride would last and what horrors awaited at the end of this long, dark hall. Story 11. The first scream echoed through the decaying halls, just as I discovered the hidden file. I froze, flashlight beam trembling on the yellowed paper, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We'd come to Oak Brook Asylum looking for urban exploration thrills, maybe some cool photos for our Instagram. Instead, we'd stumbled upon a nightmare that had been patiently waiting decades for new subjects. My name's Zoe, and until tonight, I was just another bored college student looking for an adrenaline rush. Now, as I huddle in this crumbling office, listening to the inhuman sounds of my friends being hunted through the abandoned asylum, I realize how naive we'd been. We thought we were exploring history. We didn't understand that sometimes history reaches back. It had all started as a dare, really. My best friend Liv had heard rumors about Oak Brook Asylum from her psych professor. Closed in the 1970s after a series of patient deaths and staff disappearances, it had stood abandoned for decades, a crumbling monument to outdated mental health practices and dark secrets. "Come on," Liv had said, her eyes sparkling with that mischievous glint I knew all too well. "It'll be epic. We'll take some awesome photos, maybe catch an orb or two on camera. It'll blow up on social." I'd been hesitant, but peer pressure and the promise of adventure won out. So here we were, 4 college kids with more bravado than sense, breaking into a derelict asylum on a moonless night. The place was everything an urban explorer could dream of. Peeling paint, rusted medical equipment, nature slowly reclaiming the buildings. We crept through dim corridors, our flashlights casting long shadows that seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them. "This is insane," whispered Jake, our self-proclaimed paranormal expert. "You guys feel that? The energy in this place is off the charts." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere. It felt like the very air was thick with forgotten screams and lingering despair. We made our way deeper into the complex, snapping photos and shooting video for our vlogs. It was in the administrative wing that things started to go wrong. "Hey, check this out," called Alex, our tech guru. He was standing in front of a heavy wooden door, partially hidden behind a fallen filing cabinet. "I think it's the Chief of Staff's office." Together, we pushed aside the cabinet and forced the door open. The office beyond was surprisingly well preserved, as if time had somehow forgotten this one room. Dust-covered books lined the walls, and a massive oak desk dominated the center of the space. Jagpot breathed live, already snapping photos. I moved behind the desk, running my fingers over the smooth wood. Something about this room felt different, important. My hand brushed against a small lever under the desktop. Without thinking, I pulled it. A soft click echoed in the silence, and a hidden drawer popped open. Inside was a single file folder, the name on the tab sending a chill down my spine. Project Echo. As I opened the file, the first scream tore through the building. We all jumped, nerves already on edge from the creepy surroundings. What the hell was that? Jake's voice was an octave higher than usual. "Probably just the wind," Alex said, but he didn't sound convinced. I turned back to the file, my curiosity overriding my fear. The documents inside were a mix of official reports and handwritten notes, detailing experiments that turned my stomach. Patients used as unwilling test subjects for drugs designed to enhance psychic abilities. Cruel trials aimed at pushing the human mind beyond its limits. And the results? God, the results were horrifying. "Guys," I said, my voice shaking, "I think we need to get out of here, now." But as I looked up, I realized I was alone in the office. Panic seized me. Had I been so engrossed in the file that I didn't notice them leave? Or had something taken them? I rushed to the door, only to find it closed and locked. Impossible. It had been wide open just moments ago. I pounded on the wood, shouting for my friends, but only silence answered. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper right beside my ear. "Welcome to Oakborough. We've been waiting for you." I whirled around, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. There was no one there, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt charged, alive with malevolent energy. I turned back to the door, ready to throw my whole body against it if necessary, but stopped short. Where the door had been was now a blank wall, as if it had never existed. My breathing came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. Places don't just change like that. Doors don't disappear. Unless... I thought back to the file, to the experiments described within. Patients pushed to the brink of madness and beyond. Their minds shattered but somehow expanded. What if they had succeeded? What if they had created something that could reshape reality itself? A scream jolted me from my thoughts, closer this time. I recognized Live's voice, filled with terror and pain. Instinct took over, and I found myself running towards the sound, no longer caring about impossible architecture or vanishing doors. I burst into a long corridor lined with patient rooms. The doors were all open, swinging gently on rusted hinges, as if disturbed by a recent passage. At the far end, I saw a figure disappear around the corner.
Liv!
I shouted, sprinting after her. But as I rounded the corner, I found myself not in another hallway, but in a vast, circular room. Operating theaters ringed the perimeter, and in the center stood a massive machine, all Tesla coils and ominous dials. My friends were there, strapped to gurneys, their eyes wide with terror. Around them moved things. They looked like doctors and nurses, but wrong. Their proportions were off, limbs too long, faces distorted as if seen through warped glass. One of them turned to me, its mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. "Ah, our final participant has arrived. Now we can begin anew." I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The thing that looked like a doctor glided towards me, a syringe filled with glowing blue liquid in its hand. "Don't fight it," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "Embrace the echo. Become part of something greater." As the needle approached my neck, my mind raced. The file. Project Echo. This is what they had created. A reality-warping hive mind, born from the shattered psyches of countless victims. In desperation, I closed my eyes and focused on reality as I knew it. The solid ground beneath my feet, the cool air on my skin, the world outside Oak Brook's walls. The doctor thing hissed in frustration. "No, you cannot resist. The echo is all." I opened my eyes to find myself back in the office, the file still clutched in my hands. But something was different. The air shimmered with barely visible distortions, reality fighting against an invading force. I knew then that Oak Brook wasn't just haunted. It was a breach, a weak point where something impossibly old and hungry was trying to break through. And we had just given it new anchors to our world. A plan formed in my mind. If the asylum was a focal point, then maybe. I ran through the twisting corridors, the world shifting around me with each step. Sometimes I was in decaying hallways, sometimes sterile operating rooms, sometimes places that defied description. But always, I could hear my friends screaming, the sounds growing more distorted and inhuman by the second. Finally, I found what I was looking for. The asylum's old incinerator. If I was right, destroying the physical anchor might weaken whatever was trying to break through. I stuffed the Project Echo file into the rusted chamber, then looked around for anything else to burn. Old records, moldering furniture, anything that held the asylum's psychic imprint. As I worked, the air grew thick and syrupy. Tendrils of darkness probed at the edges of my vision, and whispers filled my head, promising power beyond imagining if I'd just stop, just give in. But the screams of my friends drove me on. With shaking hands, I lit a match and tossed it into the incinerator. The effect was immediate and terrifying. A howl of rage shook the entire building, and suddenly I was surrounded by a writhing mass of shadows and half-formed figures. The doctor thing was there, its face contorted in fury. "Fool," it shrieked. "You cannot undo decades of work. The echo will consume all." But as the flames grew higher, fed by years of forgotten pain and twisted experiments, I felt the asylum's grip weakening. Reality snapped back into place like a rubber band, and I found myself standing in a normal, decaying incinerator room. The silence was deafening after the chaos of the past hour. Had it worked? Was it over? I made my way back through the asylum, noting with relief that doors stayed where they should, and corridors no longer twisted in impossible ways. I found my friends in the entrance hall, dazed and confused, but blessedly alive and whole. As we stumbled out into the cool night air, I looked back at Oakbrook Asylum one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw faces in the windows. Dozens of them, their expressions a mix of anger and relief. Then they were gone, and it was just an abandoned building once more. We never spoke publicly about what happened that night. Who would believe us? But sometimes, when the night is dark and the veil between worlds feels thin, I swear I can still hear echoes of those whispers, promising terrible wonders if I'd just come back, just open myself to the echo once more. I won't, but part of me wonders, did we really stop it? Or did we just hit pause on something that's been waiting centuries to awaken? Only time will tell. And Oakbrook Asylum still stands, patient as ever, waiting for the next group of thrill-seekers to wander into its embrace. Story 12. The first time I heard the voice through the static. I dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But as the pleas for help grew more desperate with each passing night, I realized that something in these woods was reaching out to me, and whatever it was hungry. My name is Claire Sutton, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for the past 5 years. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Every trail, every clearing, every hidden creek. But in the past week, I've come to understand that Blackwood holds secrets darker and older than I could have ever imagined. It all started on a Tuesday night, about a month ago. I was pulling a solo shift at the ranger station, a small, rustic cabin perched on the edge of the forest. It was a quiet night, the kind where the silence seems to press in on you from all sides. I was doing my usual rounds of checking the security cameras and scanning the emergency radio frequencies when I heard it. At first, it was just a burst of static, louder than usual. I was about to adjust the dial when a voice broke through, faint and distorted. Help. Trapped. Please. I sat up straighter, my hand hovering over the radio. This is Ranger Sutton at Blackwood Station. Do you copy? What's your location? Nothing but static, answered me. I spent the next hour trying different frequencies, attempting to re-establish contact, but the voice didn't return. By the time my shift ended, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The next night was the same. Hours of silence, then a burst of static, and that voice, a little clearer this time. Dark. Can't see. Help us. Again, my attempts to respond were met with silence. This pattern continued for days. Each night, the voice would break through, a little stronger, a little more desperate. And each night, I felt a growing sense of dread, a certainty that something was very wrong in my forest. I tried to talk to my supervisor about it, but he brushed off my concerns. Probably just some kids with a radio playing pranks, he said. Or maybe it's bleeding over from another park's frequency. Don't worry about it, Claire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more. The voice felt old, somehow. And there was something in its tone, a hint of something inhuman that made my skin crawl. It was on the 7th night that things escalated. The voice came through clearer than ever, no longer obscured by static. Claire, it said, and the sound of my name in that ancient, hungry voice made my blood run cold. Claire, we need you. Come find us. Set us free. I stumbled back from the radio, my heart pounding. How did it know my name? What did it mean by set us free? That's when I noticed something on one of the security camera feeds. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent the wrong way. As I watched, frozen in horror, it turned its head towards the camera. Where its face should have been was only a dark void, punctuated by pinpricks of light like distant stars. The radio crackled to life again. "We're waiting, Claire. Come to us." I don't remember deciding to move. One moment I was staring at the monitor, the next I was grabbing my jacket and flashlight, heading out into the night. Some part of me knew this was madness, that I should call for backup or at least tell someone where I was going. But the pull was irresistible, like a fishhook lodged in my mind, reeling me in. The forest at night was a different world. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I moved deeper into the woods, guided by some instinct I didn't understand. After what felt like hours, I emerged into a clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, ancient and worn. They seemed to hum with a subtle energy, vibrating at a frequency just below hearing. As I approached, the air grew thick and heavy. Whispers surrounded me, countless voices overlapping until I couldn't distinguish individual words. The stones began to glow with a sickly green light, pulsing in time with the whispers. That's when I saw them. Shapes moving in the spaces between the stones, flickering in and out of existence. They were like the figure I'd seen on the camera, all wrong angles and star-filled voids where faces should be. One of them spoke, its voice the same one I'd heard on the radio. "You came. Good. We've waited so long." I found my voice, though it shook with fear. What are you? What do you want?" The being drifted closer, its form rippling like heat haze. "We are the forgotten. Once, we were worshipped here, fed with blood and fear. But time passed, and we were abandoned, trapped between worlds. We need you, Claire. Need your voice, your connection to the world above." As it spoke, I felt a pressure building in my head, images flashing behind my eyes. I saw this clearing centuries ago, filled with robed figures performing dark rituals. I saw the moment these entities were summoned, tearing through the veil between worlds. And I saw their rage when they were eventually forsaken, left to wither in this in-between place. "No," I managed to gasp out. "I won't help you. Whatever you are, you don't belong here." The being's form solidified, becoming more tangible. I could feel its anger radiating off it in waves. "You don't have a choice, little ranger. We've been calling to you for days, preparing you. Your will is ours now." It reached for me with a hand that was more shadow than substance. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, helpless as the thing's fingers brushed my forehead. Pain exploded behind my eyes. I felt like my skull was being split open, my mind invaded by something vast and alien. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, and I saw flashes of other worlds, realities so foreign they made my sanity fray at the edges. Just as I thought I would be lost, swallowed up by this cosmic horror, a new sound cut through the chaos. A voice crackling through my radio. Claire, do you copy? Where are you?" It was Tom, my fellow ranger, probably just starting his shift and wondering where I was. That simple, human voice was like an anchor, giving me something to hold on to. With a supreme effort of will, I fought against the entity's invasion. "No," I growled, feeling something shift in the air around us. "This is my mind. my world. You're not welcome here. I grabbed my radio, thumbing the talk button. Tom, the standing stones in the North Woods. Bring help. The being shrieked, a sound that vibrated in frequencies I didn't know could exist. The other shapes surged forward, trying to stop me, but it was too late. I'd broken their hold. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear unearthly howls of rage and frustration. The woods themselves seemed to come alive, roots rising to trip me, branches reaching down to snag my clothes. But I kept going, driven by pure survival instinct. I didn't stop until I burst out of the tree line, collapsing at the feet of a very surprised Tom and 2 other rangers. "Claire, what the hell happened to you?" Tom helped me up, his face etched with concern. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly make them understand what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? In the end, I managed to gasp out, "The stones. We need to destroy them." Now, maybe it was the wild look in my eyes, or maybe some part of them sensed the wrongness in the air, but they didn't argue. We went back with chainsaws and sledgehammers, and by dawn, the standing stones were reduced to rubble. As the first light of day touched the shattered remains, I heard one final whisper on the wind. "This isn't over, Claire. We'll find another way." Another voice. "We'll be back." It's been a month since that night. I've told the official story so many times, I almost believe it myself. Illegal campers, hallucinogenic mushrooms, mass hysteria, anything but the truth. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the ranger station, I'll hear a burst of static on the radio. And in that static, just for a moment, I'll catch a whisper of something ancient and hungry, still calling out from the depths of Blackwood Forest. I don't know if we really stopped them, or just delayed the inevitable. But I do know one thing for certain. I'll be here, watching and listening, ready to face whatever comes creeping out of the dark heart of the woods, because someone has to stand guard. Someone has to answer when those whispers in the static start again. Story 13. The first time I saw a patient vanish, I thought I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. By the 3rd time, I knew that St. Mercy Hospital was hiding something far more sinister than just neglected overtime pay. As I stand here now, syringe in hand, I realize I have a choice to make. Become the next missing nurse, or join whatever shadowy experiment is happening in the depths of this hospital. My name is Alina Reyes, and until 2 weeks ago, I was just another overworked night shift nurse at St. Mercy. Sure, the place had its quirks. Ancient equipment, flickering lights, that one elevator that never seemed to go where you wanted. But what underfunded county hospital didn't? I told myself it was all part of the job. That the eerie feeling I got sometimes was just from too many double shifts and not enough sleep. But then patients started disappearing. It was subtle at first. I'd check on Mr. Johnson in room 412, then come back an hour later to find the bed empty, sheets undisturbed. When I asked about it, the day shift nurses looked at me like I was crazy. "Alina, there hasn't been a patient in 412 4 days, they'd say, showing me charts that backed up their claim. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was mixing up rooms, or patients. It had been a long night, after all. But then it happened again, and again. Mrs. Patel from 301. Gone without a trace. Her family swearing they'd never heard of Saint Mercy when I called to ask if she'd been discharged. Tommy, the 8-year-old with appendicitis and pediatrics. There, 1 minute, vanished the next. his stuffed dinosaur, the only sign he'd ever been there at all. I tried to talk to my supervisor, Dr. Sloan, about it. He listened with that patronizing smile of his, then suggested I take some time off. "You're one of our best nurses, Elena," he said, his hand lingering just a bit too long on my shoulder. "But even the best need a break sometimes." I didn't take the time off. Instead, I started investigating. I pored over patient records, looking for patterns. I talked to other night shift staff, trying to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. Most brushed me off, but a few got this look in their eyes. A mix of fear and resignation that told me they knew something but were too scared to speak up. It was Jake, one of the orderlies, who finally gave me a lead. We were having a smoke break outside, a nasty habit I'd picked up to cope with the stress, when he leaned in close. "You're not crazy, Elena," he whispered, eyes darting around as if afraid we were being watched. "I've seen it too, but you gotta be careful. Ask too many questions, and you might be next." A chill ran down my spine. Next for what, Jake? He shook his head, already backing away. "I've said too much. Just watch out for the basement. And whatever you do, don't take the service elevator after midnight." Before I could press him for more, he was gone, disappearing back into the hospital like a ghost. The basement. Of course it would be the basement. Isn't that where all good horror stories end up? I spent the next few nights trying to work up the courage to investigate. In the meantime, I kept a closer eye on my patients. I started doing hourly rounds instead of the usual 2-hour checks. I took meticulous notes, documenting every detail of each patient's condition, and still they vanished. Always during my shift, always when I was just out of sight. It was like the hospital itself was taunting me, daring me to catch it in the act. Finally, on a particularly quiet night, I made my move. I waited until the hall was clear, then slipped into the service elevator. My hand hovered over the basement button for a long moment before I finally pressed it. The descent seemed to take forever. The old elevator creaked and groaned, the lights flickering ominously. When the doors finally opened, I found myself in a dimly lit corridor I'd never seen before. The air down here was different, heavy, with a metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. The walls were bare concrete, a stark contrast to the sterile white of the upper floors, and the silence. It was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of machinery. I crept down the hallway, my footsteps echoing despite my best efforts to be quiet. At the end of the corridor was a heavy metal door, the kind you'd see in a sci-fi movie about secret government labs. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard voices approaching from the other side. Panicked, I looked for somewhere to hide. There was a small alcove a few feet back, barely big enough to squeeze into. I pressed myself into it, holding my breath as the door swung open. "Doctor." Sloan emerged, deep in conversation with a woman I'd never seen before. She wore a lab coat like his, but there was something off about her. Her movements were too fluid, her skin too perfect. "The results are promising," the woman was saying, her voice oddly modulated. "Subject 23 showed remarkable adaptive capabilities. I believe we're ready to move to the next phase." Dr. Sloan nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Excellent. And the staff? Any further suspicions?" "One nurse has been asking questions. Elena Reyes. Do you want us to take care of her?" My blood ran cold. "They were talking about me." "Doctor?" Sloan paused, considering. "Not yet. She's valuable. One of our best. Perhaps she could be. Persuaded to join the program. The woman made a sound that might have been a laugh. Very well. I'll make the preparations. We'll need a new subject soon, in any case. The integration process is taxing on the host's bodies. They moved past my hiding spot, continuing down the hall. As soon as they were out of sight, I bolted for the elevator, my mind reeling from what I'd overheard. Subjects, integration, host bodies. What the hell was going on in this hospital? The next few days were a blur. I went through my shifts in a daze, jumping at every shadow, flinching every time Doctor Sloane or one of the other senior staff came near. I knew I should run, should report what I'd seen to someone, the police, the media, but who would believe me? And more importantly, who could I trust? It all came to a head tonight. I was doing my rounds when I noticed something odd about the patient in room 517, Mr. Guzman, a kindly old man recovering from hip surgery. He was awake, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that seemed out of character. Mr. Guzman, I said softly, approaching the bed. Are you all right? Do you need something for pain? He turned to look at me, and I had to stifle a gasp. His eyes, they weren't his. Instead of the warm brown I remembered, they were a cold, metallic silver. Nurse Reyes, he said, his voice carrying that same odd modulation I'd heard in the basement. We've been expecting you. Before I could react, strong hands grabbed me from behind. I tried to scream, but a sweet-smelling cloth was pressed over my mouth and nose. As the world started to fade, I saw Dr. Sloane step into view. I'm sorry it had to come to this, Alina, he said, not sounding sorry at all. But you've seen too much. Don't worry though. You'll be joining us soon enough. I woke up strapped to a gurney in what could only be the secret lab from the basement. The room was filled with strange equipment, glowing displays showing data I couldn't begin to understand. And lined up against one wall were tanks, massive glass cylinders filled with a cloudy liquid. In each one floated a human form, their features blurred and indistinct. Doctor Sloane approached, a syringe filled with silvery liquid in his hand. Ah, good, you're awake. I wanted you to understand what's happening. You see, Alina, we're on the cusp of something magnificent. Human evolution, guided by, well, let's just say our benefactors aren't from around here. He gestured to the woman I'd seen him with before, who stepped forward. As I watched in horror, her features seemed to melt, revealing something decidedly not human underneath. We're creating a new species, Doctor, Sloane continued, his eyes gleaming with fanatical light. Stronger, smarter, immune to disease. And you, Alina, you get to be part of it. Isn't that exciting? He brought the syringe closer to my arm. All it takes is one little injection. Then you'll understand. You'll see the bigger picture. As the needle touches my skin, time seems to slow. In this moment, I realize I have a choice to make. I can fight, can try to stop whatever insanity is happening here. Or I can give in, can embrace this evolution and become something more than human. The syringe hovers there, a drop of silver liquid beating at its tip. In its reflection, I see my own eyes, wide with fear, and just a glimmer of curiosity. What will I choose? To remain human in a world gone mad, or to step into a terrifying new future? As Dr. Sloane begins to push the plunger, I make my decision, and I pray to whatever god or alien entity might be listening, that it's the right one. Because one thing is certain, After tonight, nothing will ever be the same again. Not for me, not for St. Mercy Hospital, and maybe not for the entire human race. Story 14. The first red flag should have been the clerk's smile. Too wide, too many teeth, like a shark wearing human skin. But we were exhausted. The no vacancy signs had been haunting us for miles. And the neon glow of the Starlight Motel seemed like salvation in the dead of night. If only we'd kept driving. If only we'd slept in the car. Because now, as I barricade myself in this bathroom, listening to the inhuman sounds coming from the other side of the door, I realized that checking into the Starlight wasn't just a mistake. It might be the last decision we ever make. My name is Alex Reeves, and 24 hours ago, I was just another overworked accountant looking forward to a much-needed vacation. My girlfriend, Mia, and I had been planning this cross-country road trip for months. A chance to reconnect, to escape the grind of our 9-to-5 lives and see some of the natural wonders this country has to offer. The first few days had been great. We'd visited the Grand Canyon, marveled at the red rocks of Sedona, even spent a night camping under the stars in Joshua Tree. But as we made our way through the endless expanse of the Nevada desert, things started to go wrong. It started with little things. Our GPS kept glitching, sending us down roads that didn't seem to exist on any map. The radio would only pick up static, occasionally broken by bursts of what sounded like chanting in a language neither of us recognized. And the sun seemed to hang in the sky for far too long, as if time itself was stretching like taffy. By the time we saw the flickering neon sign of the Starlight Motel, we'd been driving for what felt like days. Our eyes were gritty with exhaustion, our nerves frayed from the endless emptiness of the desert. "Thank God," Mia murmured as I pulled into the parking lot. I was starting to think we'd never find a place to stop. The motel looked like something out of a 1950s postcard, all faded pastel paint and kitschy star-shaped signs. But there was something off about it, a wrongness I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the neon lights pulsed, just a bit too fast to be comforting. Or the dead silence that enveloped the place. Not even the hum of air conditioning units to break the stillness. We made our way to the office, the gravel crunching under our feet sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The bell above the door jangled discordantly as we entered, and that's when I saw him. The clerk with a too-wide smile. "Welcome to the Starlight," he said, his voice as dry as the desert air outside. "We've been expecting you." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. How could they have been expecting us? We hadn't made any reservations, hadn't even known this place existed until we saw the sign. But Mia, bless her, was too tired to notice anything amiss. She stepped forward, credit card in hand. "Hi, we'd like a room for the night, please." The clerk's grin somehow grew even wider. "Of course. We have just the room for you. Our very last one, in fact." As he processed our payment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The office was cluttered with odd knickknacks, dream catchers made of bones, jars filled with what looked suspiciously like organs floating in murky liquid, and on the wall behind the desk, a map of the US with dozens of red pins stuck into it. Before I could examine anything too closely, the clerk was handing us an old-fashioned key attached to a heavy star-shaped keychain. "Room 13, he said. "At the very end. Enjoy your stay." The walk to our room felt longer than it should have. The motel was laid out in a horseshoe shape, and as we made our way around the curve, the office disappeared from view. With each step, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. Room 13 was at the very end of the row, set slightly apart from the others. As Mia unlocked the door, I glanced back the way we'd come. For a moment, I could have sworn the other rooms had vanished, leaving only an endless expanse of desert. But when I blinked, everything was back to normal. The room itself was unremarkable, dated decor, a musty smell, sheets that had seen better days. But it was a place to rest, and at that point, that was all we cared about. We fell into bed, too exhausted to do more than kick off our shoes. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard something, a soft scratching sound coming from the walls. But before I could investigate, exhaustion claimed me. I woke to Mia's scream. Bolting upright, I fumbled for the bedside lamp. In the harsh light, I saw Mia standing by the bathroom door, her face pale with terror. "Alex," she whispered, pointing at the mirror. "Look." I turned and felt my blood run cold. Our reflections were wrong. They moved when we moved, but their expressions were twisted into Richter's grins, their eyes black and empty, and behind them I could see things, shadowy figures that writhed and twisted in impossible ways. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing our bags. "Now." But when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The window was the same solid as a wall. Despite its fragile appearance, we were trapped. That's when the changes started. Slowly at first, the wallpaper began to bubble and peel, revealing pulsing flesh underneath. The carpet squished wetly under our feet, like walking on organs. And the sounds. God, the sounds. Whispers in languages that had never been meant for human ears. Skittering noises from inside the walls, and always, always, a deep, rhythmic pounding like a massive heart. Mia was hyperventilating, her eyes wild with panic. "What's happening?" "Alex, what's happening?" I wish I had an answer for her. I wish I could say it was all a bad dream or a hallucination from bad road food. But as the room continued to transform around us, becoming less like a motel and more like the inside of some vast, alien creature, I knew this was all too real. We retreated to the bathroom, the only part of the room that still looked somewhat normal. But even as I slammed the door shut, I could see the tiles starting to shift and warp. That was an hour ago. Now, huddled in this slowly transforming bathroom, I can hear Mia whimpering beside me. The door won't hold much longer. Something on the other side is pounding, demanding entry. Through the cracks, I can see tentacles squirming, searching for a way in. I've tried everything. My phone has no signal, the tiny window is sealed shut, and my attempts to break through the wall only revealed more pulsing, alien flesh. We're trapped, with no way out and no hope of rescue. As the door begins to splinter, a terrible realization dawns on me. The map in the office, with all those red pins. The clerk's words, "We've been expecting you." This isn't just some random encounter with the supernatural. The Starlight Motel is a trap, a lure for unsuspecting travelers, and we drove right into it. The door gives way with a wet, tearing sound. Mia screams as tentacles flood into the room, wrapping around our legs, pulling us towards the writhing mass that used to be our motel room. As I'm dragged across the threshold, I catch a glimpse of our reflections in the cracked mirror. Our duplicates are laughing silently, their faces split in triumph. In that moment, I understand. We're not the first to fall into this trap, and we won't be the last. The Starlight Motel will move on, appearing to other weary travelers in other desolate places. And each time, it will feed, adding new souls to its twisted collection. As the flesh of the room begins to envelop us, as Mia's screams fade into gurgling silence. My last coherent thought is a warning, one I know will never be heard. If you're driving late at night, if you're tired and desperate for a place to rest, and you see a sign for the Starlight Motel, keep driving. No matter how exhausted you are, no matter how inviting it looks, keep driving and don't look back. Because if you don't, you might find yourself in room 13. And trust me, you don't want to know what waits for you there. The darkness closes in, and I feel myself being pulled apart, remade into something else. The starlight has claimed us, and soon will be nothing more than another pair of reflections, waiting to lure in the next unsuspecting guests. Welcome to the Starlight Motel. We hope you enjoy your eternal stay. Story 15. The first time I saw the book levitate, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. By the time the words started bleeding off the pages, I knew I had unleashed something that should have remained buried in the darkest corners of our archives. Now, as I watched the shadows in my small town writhe and twist into impossible shapes, I realized that being a librarian in Millbrook isn't just about late fees and story time anymore. It's about saving the world from an ancient evil that I unwittingly set free. My name is Sarah Chun, and until 3 days ago, I was just the head librarian at Millbrook Public Library. It's a quiet job in a quiet town. The kind of place where the most excitement we usually get is when Mrs. Henderson forgets to turn off her cell phone during the weekly book club meeting. But all that changed when I found the book. It was during our annual deep clean of the archives, a dusty room in the basement that hadn't seen a visitor in years. I was sorting through a pile of donations from the estate of Old Man Wilkins, the town's resident eccentric who passed away last month. Most of it was junk, waterlogged paperbacks and outdated encyclopedias. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a leather cord, was a book unlike anything I'd ever seen. The cover was made of some material I couldn't identify. Not quite leather, not quite wood, with a texture that seemed to shift under my fingers. There was no title, just an intricate design that looked like a cross between a tree and a spiral galaxy. When I opened it, the pages were filled with text in a language I didn't recognize, interspersed with illustrations that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. I should have known better. I have a master's degree in library science, for crying out loud. I know the proper procedures for handling unusual acquisitions, but something about this book called to me. Before I knew it, I was taking it home, telling myself I just wanted to research it further. That night, I stayed up late, poring over the strange text. I couldn't read it, but I found myself tracing the letters with my fingers, sounding out words that had no right to exist in human language. As the hours ticked by, I felt a strange energy building in the room, like the air before a thunderstorm. It was around 3 a.m. when I saw it happen for the first time. A word on the page, a twisting, writhing thing that looked more like a sigil than any letter I knew, began to glow. As I watched, transfixed, it rose off the page, hovering in the air for a moment, before dissolving into a shower of golden sparks. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. Books didn't do that. I must have been more tired than I thought, my mind playing tricks on me. I locked the book in my desk drawer and went to bed, determined to deal with it in the morning. But morning brought no relief. As I walked to work, I noticed things changing. The shadows seemed deeper, moving in ways that defied the sun's position. I could have sworn I saw faces peering out from storm drains, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. At the library, things were even worse. Books were rearranging themselves on the shelves, their titles shifting and changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. The microfiche machine was spooling out film covered in the same strange symbols from the book, and the potted plant in the corner, a ficus that had been struggling to survive for years, was now a mass of writhing vines that seemed to reach for anyone who came too close. My assistant, Tom, didn't seem to notice anything amiss. When I tried to point out the strange occurrences, he just gave me a concerned look and suggested I take the day off. "You've been working too hard, Sarah," he said, his voice oddly distorted as if coming from very far away. "Go home and rest." But I couldn't rest. Not when I knew what was causing this. I retrieved the book from my desk, ignoring the way it seemed to pulse with an inner light, and headed to the one person in town who might be able to help. Professor Elias Blackwood. Blackwood was a retired academic who'd moved to Millbrook a few years back. Rumor had it he'd been forced out of his university position for pursuing unorthodox research interests. If anyone could make sense of this book, it would be him. The professor's house was at the edge of town, an old Victorian that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Gothic novel. As I approached, the skies seemed to darken, clouds gathering overhead despite the forecast for clear skies. Blackwood answered the door on the third knock, his wild white hair and piercing blue eyes giving him the look of a mad scientist. "Ah, Miss Chun," he said, as if he'd been expecting me. "I see you've found the Codex Umbra. Please, come in. We have much to discuss." I followed him into a study that was more library than living space, walls lined with books that looked as old and strange as the one I carried. Blackwood took the book from me with a reverence that bordered on worship. "Do you have any idea what you've found?" he asked, his voice trembling with excitement. "This is the lost work of Alphonse Derrickson, a 17th century occultist who claimed to have discovered the language of reality itself. With this, one could theoretically reshape the very fabric of existence." A chill ran down my spine. "But it's dangerous, isn't it?" "Strange things have been happening ever since I opened it." Blackwood nodded gravely. "Oh yes, very dangerous indeed. You've begun the awakening, you see. The words in this book aren't just text. They're keys, unlocking doors that were meant to stay closed. And now that they're open..." He trailed off, his gaze drawn to the window. Outside, the sky had turned a sickly green, and I could see shapes moving in the clouds. Vast, tentacled things that should not exist in our reality. "We need to stop it," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "There has to be a way to close the doors, to put things back the way they were." Blackwood turned back to me, a strange light in his eyes. "Close the doors? My dear girl, why would we want to do that? Don't you see? This is the opportunity of a lifetime. With this book, we could reshape reality itself. We could become gods." As he spoke, his form seemed to shift and waver, like a mirage in the desert. I backed away, suddenly aware that I'd made a terrible mistake in coming here. "You're one of them," I whispered. "You're not human, Blackwood," or the thing wearing Blackwood's shape, smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "I am so much more than human, Miss Chun. And soon, you will be too. All of Millbrook will be. Isn't that wonderful?" I ran out of the study, down the hall, my feet pounding on creaking floorboards that seemed to shift and buckle beneath me. Behind me, I could hear Blackwood laughing, a sound that echoed with the voices of 1,000 inhuman throats. I burst out of the house and into a world gone mad. The streets of Millbrook had become a twisted labyrinth, buildings warping and melting into each other. The sky was a kaleidoscope of impossible colors, and everywhere I looked, I saw my neighbors transforming, limbs elongating, faces melting and reforming into things that defied description. And through it all, I could hear words, the words from the book, now flowing through the air like a river of sound, reshaping reality with every syllable. I ran back to the library, the only place that still looked somewhat normal in this chaos. As I burst through the doors, I saw Tom, sweet, oblivious Tom, sitting at the circulation desk, calmly checking out books to patrons whose bodies were slowly twisting into new, horrific forms. "Tom," I shouted, "we have to stop this. The book. We need to destroy it." He looked up at me, his eyes now glowing with an eldritch light. "But why would we want to do that, Sarah? The great reshelving has begun. Soon, all the world will be one vast library, and we shall be its eternal curators." I backed away, my mind reeling. Was I the only one left untouched by this madness? As if in answer, I felt a tugging sensation in my chest, as if the very essence of who I was being rewritten. No, I wouldn't let it end like this. I am a librarian, damn it. If words have the power to unmake the world, then they must have the power to remake it too. I ran to the rare book room, ignoring the way the shelves reached for me with woody tendrils. There, on a pedestal, was the Codex Umbra, open to a page filled with writhing symbols. With shaking hands, I began to read aloud, my voice growing stronger with each word. I didn't understand the language, but I poured every ounce of my will into the words, shaping them with a librarian's precision and care. As I read, I felt the world shift around me. The chaos outside seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. The twisted forms of my neighbors began to shimmer and fade, returning to their human shapes. When I spoke the final word, there was a flash of light so bright it blinded me. When my vision cleared, I found myself standing in the library, everything back to normal. The Codex Umbra was gone, leaving behind only a faint scent of ozone and old books. Tom blinked at me from the circulation desk, looking confused. "Sarah, is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I managed a weak smile. "Everything's fine, Tom. Just remind me to be more careful about what I read from now on." As I walked home that evening, the town looked as it always had. Quaint, quiet, normal. But now I know the truth. Reality is a fragile thing, held together by words and will. And sometimes, in quiet corners of dusty libraries, there are books that can unravel it all. I am Sarah Chun, head librarian of Millbrook Public Library. And from now on, my job isn't just about keeping the shelves tidy and the late fees collected. It's about standing guard against the darkness that lurks between the pages, waiting for someone to speak the right words and set it free. Because in the end, every story has power, and some stories can end the world. Story 16. The arrow whistled past my ear, embedding itself in the cabin wall with a dull thud. I ducked, heart pounding, as another volley followed. What was supposed to be a weekend of drunken debauchery had turned into a desperate fight for survival. And as I huddled behind an overturned table, listening to the inhuman shrieks of our pursuers, I realized that my best friend's bachelor party might just be the death of us all. My name is Mike Donovan, and 48 hours ago, my biggest worry was whether we'd packed enough beer for the weekend. Now, as I clutch a makeshift weapon and try to ignore the pain of my injuries, I'm wondering if any of us will live to see Monday. It had all started innocently enough. My best friend Jake was getting married in a month, and as his best man, it was my job to throw him one last epic bash. before he tied the knot. I'd spent weeks planning the perfect getaway, a long weekend at a remote cabin in the mountains. Just the 5 of us guys, with enough booze and bad decisions to fuel a lifetime of remember when stories. The drive up had been full of laughter and anticipation. Jake, always the responsible one, had tried to temper our wilder ideas, but even he couldn't hide his excitement. Our other friends, Chris, the eternal frat boy, Tom, the quiet tech geek, and Ravi, the aspiring stand-up comedian, were all in high spirits, eager to escape the grind of city life for a few days. The cabin was everything the website had promised. Rustic charm with modern amenities, nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. As we unloaded the car, cracking jokes and playfully shoving each other, I remember thinking how perfect it all was. If only I'd known. The first night was exactly what you'd expect from a bachelor party. We grilled steaks, drank too much, and regaled Jake with embarrassing stories from our college days. As the night wore on and the whiskey flowed freely, we decided it would be a great idea to go for a midnight hike. In retrospect, that was our first mistake. The forest at night was a different world. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Strange sounds echoed in the darkness. Rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and once, a high-pitched keening that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Guys," Tom said, his voice tight with nervousness, "maybe we should head back." But Chris, already 3 sheets to the wind, just laughed. "Don't be such a pussy, Tom. Where's your sense of adventure?" We pressed on, our phone flashlights casting eerie shadows. That's when we saw it. A flicker of firelight through the trees. Curiosity piqued. We moved closer. In a small clearing stood a group of people unlike any I'd ever seen. They were tall, inhumanly so, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent at odd angles. They wore clothing that looked like it was made from bark and leaves, and their faces... God, their faces were wrong. Eyes too large, mouths filled with needle-sharp teeth, skin that seemed to shift and ripple in the firelight. We should have run. We should have turned and fled back to the safety of our cabin. But we were drunk and stupid and didn't realize the danger until it was too late. One of the creatures turned, its gaze locking onto us. It let out a shriek that sounded like metal scraping on bone, and suddenly, the entire group was advancing on us. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him along. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear the creatures pursuing, moving through the forest with an ease that no human could match. Somehow, we made it back to the cabin. We slammed the door shut, piling furniture against it as we tried to catch our breath. "What the fuck were those things?" Ravi gasped, his usual humor replaced by wide-eyed terror. Before anyone could answer, something slammed against the door with enough force to splinter the wood. We scrambled back, looking for anything we could use as weapons. The next few hours were a blur of violence and fear. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed determined to get in. They hurled themselves at the doors and windows, their inhuman shrieks filling the night air. We fought back with whatever we could find. Kitchen knives, broken chair legs, even a fire poker that Chris wielded like a sword. By dawn, we were exhausted, battered, and terrified. The attacks had stopped, but we knew it was only a temporary reprieve. As the first light of day filtered through the boarded-up windows, we took stock of our situation. Tom was hurt the worst, a deep gash on his arm where one of the creatures had managed to grab him. Ravi was tending to him, using a first aid kit we'd found under the bathroom sink. Chris was uncharacteristically quiet, his bravado shattered by the night's events. And Jake just sat in the corner, his eyes vacant, muttering something about the old gods awakening. I tried to keep it together, to be the leader they needed me to be. Okay, guys, we need a plan. The car's still out there. If we can make it, we might be able to get out of here. And go where? Chris snapped. You saw those things. They're not natural. Who's going to believe us? The cops? The army? He had a point, but I refused to give up hope. We have to try. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back. As if on cue, a new sound reached us. The twang of bowstrings, followed by the thud of arrows hitting the cabin walls. I peeked through a gap in the boards and felt my heart sink. The creatures were back, dozens of them, armed with bows that looked like they were made from living wood. They're trying to smoke us out, Tom said, his voice weak from blood loss. We can't stay here. I nodded, my mind racing. Okay, new plan. We make a run for it. The car's about 50 yards from the front door. If we go together, maybe some of us can make it. It was a desperate plan, born of desperation, but it was all we had. We gathered what weapons we could. Kitchen knives, a hatchet from the woodpile, even a can of hairspray and a lighter as a makeshift flamethrower. As another volley of arrows rained down, we steeled ourselves for what might be our last stand. On 3, I said, my hand on the doorknob. 1, 2, 3, we burst out of the cabin, running full tilt towards the car. The creatures let out a chorus of shrieks, arrows whistling past us. I saw Ravi go down, an arrow in his leg, but Chris and Tom grabbed him, half carrying him as we ran. I reached the car first, fumbling with the keys. Just as I got the door open, I heard Jake scream. I turned to see him in the grasp of one of the creatures, its long fingers wrapped around his throat. Without thinking, I charged back, swinging the hatchet with all my might. The blade bit deep into the creature's arm, green ichor spraying from the wound. It released Jake with a howl of pain, and we stumbled back to the car together. Somehow, miraculously, we all made it inside. I gunned the engine, tires spinning in the dirt as we peeled away from the cabin. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creatures gathered at the edge of the clearing, watching us go with those two large eyes. We drove in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we hit the main road, the forest receding behind us, that anyone spoke. What do we do now? Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. We get help. Real help. Someone has to believe us. But even as I said it, I knew the truth. Our lives would never be the same. We had seen something that wasn't meant for human eyes, had touched a world beyond our understanding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As we sped towards civilization, I caught Jake's eye in the rearview mirror. There was a knowledge there, a shared understanding of the horrors we'd faced and the long road ahead. This was supposed to be his bachelor party, one last hurrah before settling into married life. Instead, it had become a battle for survival, a brutal initiation into a world of ancient terrors and hidden truths. I just hoped we'd all live long enough to see him walk down the aisle, because something told me that the creatures in the woods weren't done with us yet, not by a long shot. The bachelor party was over, but our real adventure, our real nightmare, was just beginning. Story 17. The moment the lights flickered, I knew this wasn't going to be just another boring night shift. As the storm raged outside and shadowy figures began to gather at the edges of the parking lot, I realized that my little 24-hour convenience store had become ground zero for something far more terrifying than a simple robbery. Trapped behind the counter with nothing but a baseball bat and my wits, I was about to discover why they call it the graveyard shift. My name's Jamie, and up until tonight, I thought I had the easiest job in the world. Night clerk at the Quick Mart on the edge of town, where the biggest excitement usually came from drunk college kids trying to buy beer after the cutoff time. Sure, the hours sucked, and the pay was barely above minimum wage, but it was quiet, peaceful, even. A great gig for a community college student trying to make ends meet. I should have known better. In horror movies, it's always the quiet places where shit hits the fan. The night started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., nodding to day shift Dave as he headed out. The first couple of hours were business as usual. A few late-night truckers grabbing coffee, some locals picking up milk or cigarettes. Nothing I couldn't handle while half asleep. Around 1 a.m., the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, the sky opening up like someone had appended a cosmic bathtub. Lightning flashed almost continuously, and the wind howled loud enough to rattle the windows. I cranked up the volume on the ancient radio behind the counter, trying to drown out the storm with some classic rock. That's when the power first flickered. Just for a second, barely long enough to notice. But in that brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I saw something move outside. A shape darker than the night, slithering across the parking lot. I shook my head, blaming it on too many energy drinks and late-night horror flicks. But as I turned back to my dog-eared paperback, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and dimmed again. This time, the darkness lasted long enough for my eyes to adjust, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Figures stood at the edges of the parking lot, dozens of them unnaturally still, their features obscured by the driving rain. They weren't approaching the store, just watching, waiting. The lights came back on, and they were gone. I rubbed my eyes, heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. I was seeing things, that's all. The late hour, the storm, my overactive imagination. They were all playing tricks on me. But then the bell above the door chimed. I turned, customer service smile plastered on my face, out of habit. The man who walked in was soaking wet, his clothes plastered to his thin frame. Water pooled around his feet as he shuffled towards the counter. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nasty weather out there, huh?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, head bowed, water dripping from his lank hair. Something was off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Sir, can I help you with anything?" Slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl, he raised his head, and I saw his face. Or rather, the lack of it. Where features should have been was just smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank canvas of flesh. I stumbled back, knocking over a display of gum. The thing that wasn't a man took a step forward, its head tilting at an impossible angle. "We're closed," I shouted, grabbing for the baseball bat we kept under the counter for emergencies. "Get out." The creature lunged, moving faster than anything that size should be able to. I swung the bat on pure instinct, connecting with a sickening thud. The thing staggered back, its head now at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. For a moment, we just stood there, facing each other across the counter. Then, with a sound like tearing wet cardboard, its chest split open. Inside was nothing but darkness and the glint of too many teeth. I vaulted over the counter, adrenaline lending me strength and speed I didn't know I had. I slammed into the door, fumbling with the lock. But as I finally got it open and felt the first splash of rain on my face, I saw them. The figures from before, no longer at the edges of the lot, but forming a ring around the store. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all with the same blank, featureless faces. I slammed the door shut, throwing the bolt and backing away. I was trapped. The thing behind the counter was slowly pulling itself back together, its flesh knitting before my eyes. And outside, the horde waited. The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I heard something that chilled me to my core. Scratching. From all around the store, the sound of countless fingers scraping against glass and metal. When the lights came back on, the windows were covered in handprints. Smears of something dark and oily that moved and shifted even as I watched. I retreated to the stockroom, barricading the door with shelves and boxes. My phone had no signal. Of course it didn't, and the landline was dead. I was on my own. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I huddled in that small room, listening to the sounds of the store being torn apart. The crash of shelves being overturned, the tinkle of broken glass, and always, that wet, tearing sound as more of those things pulled themselves inside. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the bat and praying for dawn. But eventually, I realized the noises had stopped. An eerie silence had fallen, broken only by the faint patter of rain. Gathering what little courage I had left, I crept to the stockroom door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. No movement, no scratching, no inhuman shrieks, just silence. With shaking hands, I began to move the barricade. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to wait for help. But I knew that if I didn't act now, I might never leave this room. I inched the door open, peering out into the store. What I saw defied explanation. The place was trashed, shelves overturned, products scattered everywhere. But of the creatures, there was no sign. No bodies, no blood, nothing to indicate the horror I'd witnessed. Sunlight was starting to filter through the grimy windows. Morning had come, and with it, an end to the nightmare. Or so I thought. As I picked my way through the debris, heading for the exit, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun, bat raised, but it was just my reflection in the security mirror. Except, it wasn't me. Not exactly. The face that stared back at me was smooth and featureless, just like the creatures from the night before. I raised a hand to my cheek, and the thing in the mirror did the same. But while I felt the familiar contours of my face, the reflection showed only a blank expanse of skin. I stumbled back, a scream building in my throat. What had they done to me? What was I becoming? The bell above the door chimed, making me whirl around. Day shift Dave walked in, looking annoyed. Jesus, Jamie, what the hell happened here? Looks like a tornado hit the place. He could see me. He was talking to me normally, which meant I turned back to the mirror. My face was back, normal as ever. No sign of the featureless horror I'd seen moments before. Jamie, you okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost. I opened my mouth to tell him everything. The storm, the creatures, the long night of terror. But the words wouldn't come. Something deep inside me knew that if I spoke of it, if I acknowledged what had happened, it would somehow make it real, make it permanent. So instead, I just shrugged. Rough night, I said. Storm knocked out the power for a while. Must have spooked some animals or something. Dave shook his head, already reaching for the broom. Well, better get this cleaned up before the manager sees it. I'll give you a hand before you clock out. As we worked, I kept glancing at my reflection in the windows and mirrors. Everything looked normal. I looked normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That I had changed. I don't know what really happened that night. I don't know if it was all some sort of stress-induced hallucination, or if I really did come face to face with something beyond human understanding. But I do know this. I won't be working the graveyard shift again. And if you ever find yourself alone in a convenience store late at night, and the lights start to flicker, don't look outside. Don't look in the mirrors. And whatever you do, don't open the door. Story 18. The moment I saw the first shadow figure dart across the tracks, I knew this wouldn't be an ordinary last run of the night. As the train plunged deeper into the tunnels, and more of those things appeared, their hollow eyes fixed on my passengers, I realized that my job wasn't just about getting people home anymore. It was about getting them out alive. My name is Marcus Lee, and I've been driving trains for the Metropolitan Transit Authority for 15 years. The late-night shift on the Blue Line was usually quiet. A few night workers, some partied-out college kids, maybe a tourist or two who'd lost track of time. Nothing I couldn't handle half asleep. But tonight was different. It started normally enough. I pulled out of Central Station at 11:45 p.m., right on schedule. The car was about half full, the usual mix of weary faces and slumped shoulders. I nodded to Mrs. Grayson, the night janitor at City Hospital, who always sat in the first car, and gave a little wave to Jake, the barback from O'Malley. Sue inevitably reeked of stale beer. The first 2 stops were routine. A few people got off, a couple more got on. But as we pulled away from Riverside Station, I noticed something odd on one of the monitors. A flicker of movement in the tunnel ahead, gone almost before I could register it. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting. Probably just a rat, I told myself. The tunnels were full of them, after all. But as I watched, I saw it again. A shadow, moving far too quickly to be any kind of rodent I'd ever seen. The intercom crackled to life, making me jump. "Hey, driver!" It was Jake, his words slightly slurred. "You seeing this shit?" I thumbed the response button. "See what? There's..." "I dunno, man. Looks like people out there in the tunnel, but they're moving weird." A chill ran down my spine, so I wasn't the only one seeing things. I keyed the intercom again, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everyone stay in your seats, please." Probably just some maintenance workers. But I knew that wasn't true. In 15 years, I'd never seen maintenance crews this far out, this late at night. And they sure as hell didn't move like that. As the train hurtled through the darkness, I kept my eyes glued to the monitors. The shadows were getting bolder, darting closer to the tracks, and now I could see them more clearly. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. A scream from the passenger car snapped my attention away from the screens. Mrs. Grayson was pressed against the window, her face a mask of terror. I followed her gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. One of the things was keeping pace with the train, running alongside us with an ease that defied physics. Its face, if you could call it that, was pressed against the glass. A featureless void save for 2 glowing points of light where eyes should be. I did the only thing I could think of. I gunned the engine. The train lurched forward, picking up speed. For a moment, I thought we might outrun them. But then I saw more of them ahead, hundreds of them, their bodies writhing and twisting in the beam of the train's headlights. "Oh God," I whispered, my hands white-knuckled on the controls. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The intercom crackled again. This time it was a woman's voice, high and panicked. "Driver, what's happening? What are those things?" I didn't have an answer. How could I? Nothing in my training had prepared me for shadow monsters in the tunnels, but I knew I had to do something. These people were my responsibility. I had to get them out of here. I keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and stay in your seats. We're experiencing some unusual activity in the tunnels. I'm going to try to get us to the next station as quickly as possible." Even as I said it, I knew it was a long shot. The next station, Oakwood, was still 10 minutes away at normal speeds. And with those things out there, 10 minutes felt like an eternity. I pushed the train to its limits, the wheels screeching against the rails as we took curves faster than we ever should have. The shadows kept pace, their forms rippling and stretching in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at them. Through the cameras, I could see the panic spreading in the passenger car. People were huddled together, some praying, others crying. Jake had his face buried in his hands, racking back and forth. And Mrs. Grayson was gone. I blinked, sure I must be mistaken. But no, her seat was empty. And as I watched, another passenger, a young man in a business suit, simply vanished. There 1 second, gone the next. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The shadows weren't just chasing us. They were taking people. I grabbed the intercom, my voice shaking. "Everyone, listen to me. Get to the center of the car, away from the windows and doors. Hold onto each other. Don't let go, no matter what." Through the cameras, I saw them huddle together, forming a tight knot in the middle of the car. But the shadows were inside now, seeping through cracks and seams like smoke. I watched in horror as tendrils of darkness wrapped around ankles and wrists, trying to pull people away. We were less than 5 minutes from Oakwood now, but it felt like we were moving through molasses. The shadows were everywhere, filling the tunnel, blotting out the emergency lights along the walls. The only illumination came from the train itself, a tiny bubble of light in an ocean of darkness. And then, miraculously, I saw it. The platform of Oakwood Station, brightly lit and blessedly empty. I hit the brakes, praying we'd stop in time, praying the shadows wouldn't overtake us in these last crucial moments. The train screeched to a halt, the doors hissing open. "Go!" I shouted into the intercom. "Everyone out, now." I watched through the cameras as the remaining passengers, less than half of those we'd started with, stumbled onto the platform. The shadows swirled around them, grasping, pulling, but seeming unable to fully materialize in the station's bright fluorescent lighting. I should have stayed in the driver's cabin, should have closed the doors and radioed for help, but I couldn't leave them. These were my passengers, my responsibility. I stepped out of the cabin and immediately felt the cold. It was like plunging into an ice bath, the chill seeping into my very bones. The shadows twisted around me, their touch leaving trails of frost on my skin. "Move!" I yelled, herding the shell-shocked passengers towards the stairs. "Get up to the street!" We ran, the shadows nipping at our heels. I could hear them whispering, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Promises of power, of knowledge, of eternal life. All we had to do was give in, let them take us into the darkness. I saw Jake stumble, a tendril of shadow wrapped around his leg. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. "Don't listen to them," I shouted. "Keep moving." We burst out of the station into the cool night air, the streetlights casting warm pools of yellow on the sidewalk. Behind us, I could hear the shadows seething, trapped in the tunnels below. For a long moment, we all just stood there, gasping for breath, unable to believe we'd made it. Then the questions started. What were those things? Where are the others? What do we do now? I didn't have answers. How could I? I was just a train driver, not some expert on supernatural subway monsters. But as I looked at the frightened faces around me, I knew I had to say something. "I don't know what those things were," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I don't know why they took some of us and not others. But I do know this. We survived. We're here, we're alive, and we're going to stay that way." I pulled out my phone, relieved to see I had signal. "I'm calling this in. The authorities, the Transit Commission, hell, probably the army. Someone's going to want to know what happened down there." As I dialed, I looked back at the station entrance. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a pair of glowing eyes peering out from the darkness. Then it was gone. I don't know if they'll believe us. I don't know if we'll ever understand what really happened in those tunnels. But I do know one thing for certain. I'm never taking the last train again, and neither should you. Because sometimes, in the deep dark tunnels beneath the city, the things that go bump in the night are all too real. And they're hungry for more than just your fare. Story 19. The moment I saw the little girl's face in my viewfinder, I knew I'd captured something I was never meant to see. As I lowered my camera, my blood ran cold. The hallway in front of me was empty, but the image on my screen told a different, more terrifying story. One that would drag me into a nightmare I might never escape. My name is Alex Winters, and until yesterday, I was just another struggling real estate photographer trying to make ends meet in a cutthroat market. Now I'm not sure what I am, or if I'll live long enough to figure it out. It all started with a call from Jeremy, my agent. "Got a gig for you, Alex. Old Victorian on Maple Street. Owner wants a full set of interior and exterior shots. Says the place hasn't been photographed in decades. I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why a house that grand had gone so long without being on the market. But work had been slow, and I was behind on rent. So I jumped at the chance." The house loomed over me as I pulled up, all gabled roofs and ornate woodwork. It might have been beautiful once, but years of neglect had taken their toll. Paint peeled in long strips, revealing grayed wood underneath. Overgrown vines choked the porch columns, and more than a few windows were boarded up. "Great," I muttered, grabbing my gear from the trunk. The Scylla looked fantastic on Zillow. The front door creaked open at my touch, swinging inward to reveal a dusty foyer. The air inside was stale, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite place. Something metallic, almost coppery. "Hello," I called out. "Mr. Crane." "It's Alex Winters, the photographer." No answer. Just the settling of old wood and the skittering of what I hoped were just mice in the walls. I shrugged, figuring the owner must be running late. Might as well get started on the exterior shots while the light was good. For the next hour, I circled the house, snapping photos of crumbling brickwork and overgrown gardens. Through my lens, I tried to find angles that made the decay look charming rather than creepy. It wasn't easy. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, I decided to head inside. The fading light would be perfect for some moody interior shots. The foyer was as I'd left it, but something felt off. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and started setting up my tripod. The first few rooms were uneventful. Dusty furniture, faded wallpaper, the usual abandoned house fare. But as I moved deeper into the house, things got weird. In the kitchen, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of something pale darting behind the ancient refrigerator. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. The dining room was worse. As I framed up a shot of the ornate chandelier, I felt a cold breeze on the back of my neck, which was impossible because there were no open windows. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. It was in the upstairs hallway that everything went to hell. I was lining up a shot of the long corridor, trying to capture the way that peeling wallpaper created interesting textures in the fading light. That's when I saw her. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, standing at the far end of the hall. She wore an old-fashioned dress, all frills and lace, but it was torn and stained with something dark. Her face was pale, too pale, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dimness. I blinked, sure I must be seeing things. But when I looked through the viewfinder again, there she was, clear as day. My finger trembled as I pressed the shutter release. The moment the photo was taken, the girl vanished. I lowered the camera, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The hallway was empty. No little girl, no sign anyone had been there in years. With shaking hands, I pulled up the image on my camera screen, and there she was, looking directly at the camera, her eyes now black pits, her mouth open in a silent scream. I nearly dropped the camera. This wasn't possible. Ghost photos were the stuff of cheap tabloids and horror movies, not real life. There had to be a rational explanation. But as I stood there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, I heard it. A soft giggle echoing from somewhere deeper in the house. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this house and never look back. But something held me in place. Curiosity, stupidity, or something else. Something pulling me deeper into this nightmare. I moved down the hall, toward where the little girl had been. Each step felt like wading through molasses, the air growing thicker, colder. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. As I watched, it slowly creaked open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just another soft giggle, this time from inside the room. I raised my camera, using it almost like a shield. Whatever was in there, I'd capture it. Prove to myself and the world that I wasn't going crazy. The room beyond was a child's bedroom, frozen in time. Dusty dolls lined shelves, their glass eyes seeming to follow me as I entered. A rocking horse sat in one corner, swaying gently despite the lack of breeze. And there, in the center of the room, was the little girl. She stood with her back to me, head bowed, shoulders shaking as if she were crying. But the sound coming from her wasn't sobbing. It was laughter, high and cold and utterly devoid of joy. I raised the camera, my finger hovering over the shutter release. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" The laughter stopped. Slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl. The girl began to turn. I pressed the shutter, the flash momentarily blinding me in the dim room. When my vision cleared, the girl was facing me, and I saw her face, or rather, the lack of it. Where features should have been was just smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank canvas of flesh. I screamed, stumbling backward. My back hit the wall, and suddenly the girl was right in front of me, her hands now ending in long, sharp claws, reaching for my face. I brought the camera up like a weapon, snapping photo after photo. Each flash seemed to drive her back, her featureless face contorting in silent rage. I don't remember running from the room. Don't remember clattering down the stairs or bursting out of the front door. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, tires squealing as I peeled away from that nightmare house. It wasn't until I was miles away, pulled over on the side of the road and hyperventilating, that I dared to look at my camera again. The photos were there, all of them, the little girl in the hallway, the empty room, and the final shots capturing something that should not, could not exist. But as I flipped through them, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In each successive image, the girl was closer to the camera, closer to me, her featureless face stretching and distorting as if she were trying to push through the very fabric of the photograph. And in the last image, taken just before I fled, I saw something that made me want to throw the camera away and never touch it again. In the background, reflected in a dusty mirror, was my own face. But it was wrong. My features were blurring, shifting, becoming as smooth and blank as the little girl's. I don't know what I captured in that house. I don't know if what I saw was real, or if I've somehow lost my mind. But I do know one thing. I'm not going back. Not to that house. Not to any house. Because now, every time I raise my camera, I'm terrified of what I might see through the lens. And even more terrified of what might be looking back. I've got one last job to do. I'm going to send these photos to Jeremy, my agent. Let him deal with Mr. Crane and whatever the hell is going on in that house. And then I'm done. I'm getting rid of my cameras, my lenses, everything. Because some things aren't meant to be captured. Some things should stay hidden, unseen by human eyes. And I just pray that whatever I let out, whatever followed me home through those images, stays trapped in the digital realm. Because if it doesn't, if it finds a way to fully cross over, well, let's just say I might be in the market for a photographer of my own. Someone to document what's left of me when it's done. Story 20. The moment we stepped into the hidden valley, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The air was too still, the colors too vivid, the silence too absolute. As the passage behind us sealed shut, trapping us in this primordial paradise, I realized we hadn't discovered Eden. We'd stumbled into a nightmare that had been patiently waiting for new prey. My name is Dr. Elena Reyes, and 3 days ago, I was just another ambitious anthropologist looking to make her mark on the world. Now, as I huddle in this makeshift shelter, listening to the inhuman shrieks of my former colleagues, I wonder if anyone will live to tell our story. It all started with a rumor. Whispers in remote Andean villages of a hidden valley, untouched by time, where the old gods still walked. Most of my peers dismissed it as folklore, but I saw an opportunity. If there was even a grain of truth to the tales, it could rewrite everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian civilizations. I assembled a team. Myself, Dr. James Chun, our linguist, Maria Suarez, our botanist, and Tom Harding, our guide and survival expert. We spent months poring over ancient texts, piecing together clues from a dozen different cultures. And finally, we found it. A hidden passage high in the Andes, concealed behind a waterfall that only appeared during the spring equinox. As we squeezed through the narrow opening, water pounding at our backs, I felt a surge of triumph. We were about to make history. If only I'd known what kind of history we were about to make. The passage opened onto a vista that took my breath away. A lush valley stretched before us, ringed by snow-capped peaks that seemed to scrape the sky. The flora was like nothing I'd ever seen. Plants with impossible geometries and colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Butterflies the size of dinner plates fluttered past, their wings shimmering with patterns that seemed to move of their own accord. "My God," Maria whispered, her eyes wide. "These species, they're completely unknown to science." "This is incredible." James was equally awestruck, furiously scribbling notes. "The air pressure, the quality of light, it's all wrong. It's like we've stepped into another world entirely." Only Tom seemed uneasy, his hand resting on the machete at his hip. "Something's off," he muttered. "It's too quiet. Where are the birds? The animals?" I was too excited to heed his warning. "Come on," I said, already moving deeper into the valley. "Let's set up camp and start documenting everything." That first day was a frenzy of activity. Maria collected plant samples, marveling at their impossible biology. James discovered rock carvings in a language he'd never seen before, eyes gleaming with the challenge of deciphering them. Even Tom seemed to relax, setting up a perimeter around our camp with his usual efficiency. It wasn't until nightfall that we realized our first mistake. The sun didn't set, it just stopped, hanging motionless on the horizon, bathing everything in an eternal golden hour. "This isn't possible," Tom said, checking his watch for the 100th time. "It's been sunset for 6 hours now." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's some kind of atmospheric effect, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew. We'd crossed the threshold into somewhere that didn't play by the rules of our world. That night, or what passed for night in this place, we huddled around the campfire, our earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of unease. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and more than once, I caught glimpses of something large moving just beyond the firelight. It was James who saw them first. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the tree line. "Do you see them?" At first, I didn't. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Figures, standing motionless among the trees. They were tall, impossibly so, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. And their faces. I wish I could say I didn't see their faces, but I did. They were like nothing I'd ever seen, a writhing mass of features that seemed to shift and change even as I looked at them. "We need to leave," Tom said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." But when we turned to go back the way we came, we found our path blocked. Where the passage had been was now solid rock, as if it had never existed. We were trapped. The next 2 days were a blur of terror and discovery. We tried to maintain some semblance of scientific inquiry, documenting the impossible flora and fauna around us. But it was hard to focus on data collection when you're being hunted, because that's what was happening. The creatures, we took to calling them the Watchers, never approached us directly, but they were always there, just at the edge of our vision, moving when we weren't looking. And each time we saw them, they were closer. Maria was the first to go. We woke up on the second day to find her missing from her tent. Her sleeping bag was shredded, and a trail of strange, iridescent fluid led into the forest. We followed it for hours, calling her name, but found nothing. That night, we heard her voice, calling from the darkness. "Elena, James, help me. I've found something amazing." Tom had to physically restrain James from running towards the sound. "That's not Maria," he growled. "Not anymore." He was right. As we watched, a figure emerged from the trees. It looked like Maria, moved like Maria, even smiled like her. But its eyes were all wrong. Black pits that seemed to go on forever. "Don't you want to see?" it asked in Maria's voice. "Don't you want to know?" James broke free from Tom's grip and ran towards the thing wearing our friend's face. We never saw him again. Now it's just Tom and me, huddled in this makeshift shelter. We've pushed what's left of our supplies against the entrance, but we know it won't hold them for long. The watchers are closer now, no longer bothering to hide. I can hear them moving outside, their bodies making wet, slithering sounds as they circle our shelter. They're speaking now, using the voices of Maria and James, promising us wonders beyond imagination, knowledge that would revolutionize our understanding of the universe. All we have to do is come out. All we have to do is join them. Part of me wants to. God help me, part of me is tempted. Because underneath the terror, there's a curiosity I can't quite squash. What are these beings? What is this place? How does it defy everything we thought we knew about reality? But Tom's hand on my arm anchors me to sanity. "Don't listen," he whispers. "Whatever happens, whatever they offer, don't listen." I nod, gripping my journal tightly. I've documented everything, every impossible sight, every terrifying encounter. If by some miracle we make it out of here, the world needs to know. They need to be warned. Because I understand now. This valley, this lost world, it's not just a place, it's alive. The watchers, the strange plants and animals, even the very air we breathe. It's all part of some vast alien intelligence. And we're not explorers making a great discovery. We're food. The walls of our shelter are beginning to melt, the material running like wax as something pushes through from the other side. I can see faces in the fluid, my own, Tom's, Maria's, James', all twisted in expressions of ecstasy and agony. Tom grips my hand, his eyes meeting mine. There's no fear there anymore, just grim determination. "Together?" he asks. I nod, swallowing hard. Together, as the shelter dissolves around us and the watchers close in, their bodies morphing and stretching into impossible shapes. I have one last, coherent thought. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leading us here. I'm sorry for letting my ambition blind me to the danger. And I'm sorry for whatever might follow us back to our world, if any part of us survives this. To anyone who might find this journal, destroy it. Seal up the passage. Forget this place exists. Because in this hidden valley, in this lost world untouched by time, the old gods don't just walk, they hunger. And now, they know we're here.